Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
I grew up in West Virginia and spent almost my entire life there. It wasn't until about 2 years ago that I finally left, and looking back, it was probably one of the best decisions I've ever made. I hear people romanticize those mountains all the time. They talk about the breathtaking scenery, the endless forests, the quiet roads, and the sense of freedom you supposedly find out there. I understand why. They really are beautiful. There are mornings when the fog settles between the ridges, the trees stretch farther than you can see, and everything looks like something out of a painting. I don't think anyone could honestly deny how incredible that landscape is. But beauty and peace aren't always the same thing. As the years went by, I started feeling like those mountains were closing in around me. I lived in an incredibly isolated community, and although things have improved a lot compared to when I was growing up, the mindset in many places is still very old-fashioned. People tend to know everything about everyone else's lives. Outsiders aren't always welcomed, and it can sometimes feel like you're trapped in a place where nobody ever truly moves forward. Eventually, I realized I couldn't picture the rest of my life there. Over the years, I experienced more unsettling situations than I care to remember, which probably isn't surprising considering how remote some parts of Appalachia really are. Those mountains attract all kinds of people. Some come looking for peace and solitude. Others come because they know there are places where nobody asks questions. Then there are the people who have lived there their entire lives, who smile, wave, and act like the friendliest neighbors you've ever met, only for everyone to discover years later that they were hiding something unimaginably disturbing. I even ended up involved in a court case against the man who lived directly across the road from us, because he was the kind of person parents quietly kept their children away from. If you know what I mean, you probably don't need me to explain any further. What I'm about to tell you happened when I was 8 years old. Back then, parents gave their kids far more freedom than they probably would today. In places like ours, where the nearest town was a long drive away and the forest surrounded everything, there wasn't much else for children to do besides disappear outside for the day. We practically grew up among the trees. From a very young age, we learned how to respect wildlife, keep our distance from black bears, leave snakes alone, recognize animal tracks, and avoid putting ourselves in dangerous situations. Looking back, it's almost funny that we were taught how to survive encounters with wild animals, yet nobody ever spent much time explaining that the most dangerous thing we could run into out there wasn't an animal at all. It was another person. Our school was tiny. When I say tiny, I mean there were only about 13 students altogether, spread across different grades in the same building. We barely had enough kids to fill a classroom, and if I'm being completely honest, I don't think I received much of an education during those years. Most days felt more like babysitting than actual school. Since there wasn't much happening in our little community, we'd invent games and stupid competitions to entertain ourselves. Like kids everywhere, we were obsessed with proving who was brave and who was still just a little kid. If you backed out of a challenge, you could expect to hear about it for weeks. A few miles from where we lived stood an old, abandoned house deep in the woods. Years before, 2 children had reportedly drowned in the small lake behind the property, and ever since then the place had developed a reputation throughout the area. People claimed it was haunted. Adults rarely talked about it, but kids never stopped. Every strange noise became part of the legend. Every shadow in the trees turned into another ghost story. Before long, walking up to that house had become the ultimate test of courage. Anyone willing to go there after dark had supposedly proven they were grown up. Anyone who refused was labeled a coward. Unfortunately for me, I lost one of those stupid bets. The punishment was simple. That night, after our parents had gone to bed, I had to follow the older boy I'd lost too, all the way out to the abandoned house. The rest of the group would wait outside while I went in completely alone. My job was to make it all the way upstairs, walk to the front window, wave so everyone could see me, and then come back out. Looking back now, I can't believe any of us thought this was a good idea. But when you're 8 years old, embarrassing yourself in front of your friends somehow feels scarier than walking into an abandoned house in the middle of the woods. The night we chose couldn't have been more memorable. There was a full moon overhead, bright enough that you could actually make out the outlines of the trees and the old dirt road leading to the property. Around there, nights are usually so dark that once the sun disappears, you can barely see your own hand in front of your face. That evening was different. The moonlight made everything strangely visible, which should have been comforting, but somehow it wasn't. If anything, it made the whole place feel even more unsettling. Every story we'd ever heard about full moons, ghosts, bad luck, and things hiding in the woods came flooding back into my mind. We were just children, and we'd spent years terrifying each other with stories exactly like those. By the time we reached the house, I was shaking so badly it felt less like fear and more like my entire body had forgotten how to stop trembling. When I finally stepped inside, my first thought wasn't about ghosts. It was that the floor was going to collapse beneath me. The old wooden boards had absorbed years of moisture, and every step made them bend just enough that I was convinced I was about to fall straight through into the basement. A few yards farther in, though, the floor suddenly became much sturdier. It almost looked as if someone had repaired sections of it long after the rest of the house had been abandoned, which struck me as odd even back then, although I was far too frightened to think much about it. I kept moving because all I wanted was to get it over with as quickly as possible. I climbed the staircase one careful step at a time. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it echoing inside my own ears. At one point, I became so dizzy that I nearly lost my balance and tumbled back down the stairs. Somehow, I caught myself, took a deep breath, and forced myself to keep going until I reached the second floor. I walked over to the front window, exactly like we'd planned, and raised my hand. Outside, I could see the rest of the group gathered near the tree line, all staring up toward the house. One of them spotted me almost immediately and pointed excitedly in my direction. I started waving back. Then I noticed that he wasn't pointing at me. He was pointing at the man standing directly behind me. It all happened instantly. Everything seemed to unfold at exactly the same moment. The kids outside started screaming. I caught a reflection in the dusty window. and I realized there was someone standing only a few feet behind me. Every ounce of blood seemed to drain out of my body. I froze for what couldn't have been more than a fraction of a second before turning around, and I came face to face with a man whose appearance has never left my memory. He had an enormous beard that covered most of his face, and in one of his hands he was holding what looked unmistakably like a gun. The moment our eyes met, every instinct inside me completely shut down. I don't think words can properly describe the level of panic I felt. My chest tightened so violently that I honestly thought I was about to pass out right there. Time almost stopped. I remember seeing his arm beginning to move, realizing he was raising the weapon, and understanding that if I hesitated for even another second, I might never make it out of that house. I never made a conscious decision. My body reacted before my mind had any chance to catch up. Right beside me, leaning against an old cabinet, was some kind of heavy object. To this day, I couldn't tell you what it actually was because I never stopped long enough to look. I grabbed it with both hands and threw it as hard as I possibly could. By what can only be described as pure luck, it struck him directly in the head. He stumbled just enough for me to squeeze past him before he could recover. I ducked underneath his arm, nearly tripped over my own feet, and practically threw myself down the staircase. I don't remember touching half the steps. I was sliding, jumping, grabbing the railing, doing anything I could to get outside. The second I reached the front door, I burst through it without even looking back. By then, every other kid had already disappeared. The group that had been waiting outside had scattered the moment they realized there was someone else inside the house, and I suddenly found myself completely alone. I ran harder than I had ever run in my entire life. My house wasn't terribly far away, maybe 10 minutes if you walked, but I covered that distance faster than I ever thought was physically possible. The entire time, I was convinced he was chasing me. Every snapping branch behind me sounded like footsteps. Every gust of wind through the trees felt like someone closing the distance. Looking back now, he probably wasn't following me at all, but fear has a way of inventing things your brain can't separate from reality. I didn't dare turn around even once. I just kept running until I saw the lights from our house shining through the trees. The second I got close enough to see the porch, I started screaming. I didn't care how loud I sounded or whether I woke the entire neighborhood. My parents came rushing outside almost immediately, and I can still remember the expressions on their faces. They looked just as terrified as I was, trying to figure out why I was crying so hard that I could barely breathe. Between gasps, I told them everything. I expected them to yell at me. I expected to be grounded for sneaking out in the middle of the night. Instead, they wrapped me in blankets, sat me down, and listened from beginning to end without interrupting. When I finally finished, they told me they were just thankful I had made it home alive. They said they hoped I understood now that the woods weren't a playground and that stupid dares weren't worth risking my life over. Looking back, that was probably the only positive thing that came out of the entire experience. At a time when plenty of parents would have punished their kids first and asked questions later, mine recognized that I was completely traumatized. They chose compassion over anger, and I've never forgotten that. The following morning, my dad contacted the sheriff's office, and deputies went out to inspect the property. They searched the house from top to bottom and found nothing that suggested anyone had been living there. No sleeping bag, no food, no clothing, no campfire, Nothing. It was as if the man had simply vanished. Because everything had happened so quickly, I couldn't even give them a useful description. I knew he was white. I knew he had an unusually long beard, and I knew he'd been holding what looked like a firearm. Beyond that, my memory was almost blank. Terror has a strange way of erasing details you wish you'd remembered. Even now, decades later, this remains one of those memories that can still trigger an almost physical reaction. Every time I think about turning around and seeing that man standing only a few feet behind me, my stomach knots up, my pulse jumps, and for a split second, it feels like I'm back inside that house all over again. Maybe that feeling will fade someday. I honestly don't know if it ever will. What I do know is that I still don't like being alone at night. I avoid walking through isolated areas after dark whenever I can, and nothing on earth could ever convince me to step inside another abandoned house. Some fears stay with you because they're irrational. Others stay because, once upon a time, they were completely real. Everything I'm about to tell you happened earlier this year. And even now, neither my wife nor I have been able to come up with an explanation that makes any sense. I know people are going to suggest we imagined it, that we were exhausted, that we accidentally ate something bad, or that it was some kind of hallucination caused by being deep in the wilderness. I can tell you right now that none of that happened. We hadn't eaten anything spoiled. We hadn't taken anything that could have altered our minds, and we were both completely clear-headed. More importantly, we both experienced the exact same thing. We both heard it. We both saw it. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't sleep paralysis, and it wasn't one person influencing the other afterward. Something happened out there, and whatever it was has stayed with both of us ever since. I'm going to tell you exactly what happened because if someone out there has an explanation that actually fits what we experienced, I'd genuinely like to hear it. I already posted this story on an online forum a while back, and people came up with all kinds of theories. Some were interesting, some were completely out there, but none of them felt remotely close to what we witnessed. Even so, I appreciate everyone who tried, because at this point, I almost feel like I need to organize this memory inside my own head. I need to put a name to it, or at least convince myself that what happened has some kind of explanation. My wife and I had planned an 8-day hiking trip through the Appalachians, something that wasn't unusual for us at all. We spend a lot of time outdoors, although we usually hike sections of the Pacific Crest Trail or explore areas farther south. This time we decided it was finally time to come back to the Appalachian Mountains. The funny thing is, we'd actually been there once before, about 10 years earlier, right after we got married. It had been one of the places we visited during our honeymoon. I know that probably sounds strange to a lot of people. Most couples picture beaches, luxury hotels, or cruises when they think about a honeymoon. We packed backpacks, climbing gear, a tent, and spent weeks hiking through different mountain ranges instead. That's always been who we are. We both love climbing, backpacking, camping, and disappearing into nature whenever life allows it. The Appalachians ended up becoming one of our favorite memories from that trip because the scenery was honestly breathtaking. It's one of those places that somehow manages to make you feel incredibly small while reminding you how unbelievably beautiful the world can be. We'd talked for years about going back, but life kept getting in the way, and this year we finally made it happen. It's strange how one experience can completely change the way you remember a place. Every time I think about those mountains now, I don't just remember our honeymoon anymore. I remember what happened this year, and I honestly don't know if I'll ever be able to separate the two memories again. Our route was supposed to take us through several waterfalls that used to be connected by an old hiking trail. The trail itself had been closed years ago after multiple drowning accidents. 2 people had disappeared there without ever being found, one of them a child, and eventually the authorities decided it wasn't safe enough to keep the route open. That didn't really discourage us because we'd spent years hiking through places where there weren't any marked trails at all. We were comfortable navigating with maps, GPS equipment, compasses, and experience. We knew how to travel through terrain that most people avoided. The first 3 days were everything we'd hoped they would be. The weather was perfect, the forest seemed endless, and every overlook somehow looked even better than the last one. The mountains were exactly as we'd remembered them. Beautiful, peaceful, and almost impossibly wild. Of course, we respected the place. Anyone who spent enough time out there knows how quickly those mountains can humble you. A wrong turn, a steep slope, or a swollen creek can become dangerous faster than people realize. Still, those first few days couldn't have gone better. Everything changed on the 4th night. By then we'd wandered far enough off the established routes that there weren't any maintained trails nearby anymore. We'd intentionally chosen a more remote section because that's usually where we enjoy ourselves the most. It was probably around 11 at night. My wife was already inside the tent, reading while I stayed outside a little longer, cleaning up after dinner and making sure we hadn't left anything behind that might attract wildlife. That's when I heard it. At first, I couldn't even process what I was listening to. Before I could say anything, my wife burst out of the tent, looking completely panicked, and immediately asked if I could hear it too. I didn't even have to answer, because it was impossible to miss. Somewhere deep in the forest, a woman was screaming. Except, screaming somehow isn't the right word. It sounded like pure agony, but there was something almost unreal about it at the same time. The closest comparison I can think of is the way sirens are portrayed in old operas or ancient stories. There was something hauntingly beautiful hidden inside that sound. Something that pulled at you emotionally while simultaneously filling you with absolute dread. It was heartbreaking. That's honestly the only way I know how to describe it. Listening to her made me feel like crying myself. There was so much pain in those cries that it almost felt physically impossible not to react. We stood there frozen for what felt like forever, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. Eventually, we convinced ourselves that whatever was happening, somebody might actually need help. We were experienced hikers. We carried enough equipment to protect ourselves if something went wrong, and neither of us thought we could simply ignore someone who sounded like they were suffering that much. So we grabbed our flashlights and started moving toward the cries. The problem was that it was already completely dark. Even with good lights, navigating unfamiliar terrain at night is nothing like hiking during the day. Within 5 minutes, we realized we'd made a terrible mistake. We were completely disoriented. The woman's cries seemed to bounce through the forest in ways that made absolutely no sense. 1 second it sounded like she was directly ahead of us, then it shifted behind us, then somewhere off to the left, until eventually it felt as though it was coming from every direction at once. Then it stopped. Just stopped. We immediately tried retracing our steps to get back to our campsite, but neither of us could figure out where we'd come from. We kept walking in circles through the trees, trying to recognize landmarks that all looked identical in the darkness. At one point, I grabbed my wife's arm and realized she was freezing cold. Not because of the temperature, but because she was absolutely terrified. Getting lost in the Appalachian wilderness at night is already bad enough. Getting lost while following screams you can't explain is something else entirely. Eventually, we decided we had to stop moving for a few minutes and calm ourselves down. We figured we'd have a better chance of finding our bearings if we stayed still instead of blindly wandering deeper into the forest. The moment we stopped, the crying started again. This time there was one major difference. We could both clearly tell where it was coming from. It was somewhere off to our right. We looked at each other without saying much. We were frightened, exhausted, completely lost, and yet neither of us could shake the feeling that someone desperately needed help. Against every ounce of common sense we had, we started walking toward the sound again. After several minutes, something slowly appeared between the trees. It was a house. Even from a distance, under nothing more than moonlight, it was obvious the place had been abandoned for years. Parts of the roof had collapsed, windows were broken, and the entire structure looked like the forest had been trying to swallow it for decades. Our first thought was that maybe someone had taken shelter inside after getting injured or while trying to escape an animal. Nothing else made sense. As we got closer, we finally saw her. She was standing upstairs, framed by one of the broken windows, looking upward into the night, while crying with exactly the same heartbreaking sound we'd been following through the woods. There was no question that she was the source of it. Then, without warning, she looked directly at us. The crying stopped instantly. Complete silence filled the forest. She stared at both of us for a second that somehow felt much longer than it actually was. And then she smiled. I've spent weeks trying to explain that smile, and I can't. It wasn't exaggerated or unnatural. It wasn't impossibly wide like something from a horror movie. It was simply a smile that every instinct inside my body immediately recognized as dangerous. I don't know how else to describe it. Sometimes your brain understands something before your conscious mind does. Every survival instinct I have screamed that we needed to leave immediately. My wife grabbed my arm at the exact same moment I reached for hers, and without either of us saying a single word, we both turned and ran. I stumbled almost immediately and hit the ground hard. My wife stopped without hesitating, pulled me back onto my feet, and we just kept running. Neither of us had any idea where we were going anymore. We only knew we needed as much distance as possible between ourselves and that house. Behind us, the crying started again. It sounded exactly the same as before, except now it seemed impossible to locate. It echoed through the trees until it almost felt like it wasn't coming from the forest anymore. It felt like it was inside our own heads. We never looked back. We spent the entire night stumbling through the mountains, walking until daylight finally gave us enough visibility to orient ourselves again. We never found our campsite. We never found our backpacks, our tent, or any of our gear. By that point, neither of us cared. We didn't want our equipment anymore. We just wanted to get out of those mountains. Eventually, we reached a small, nearby community, explained that we'd gotten lost, arranged transportation back to where we'd left our car, and drove home without ever returning for anything we'd left behind. I haven't been back to that part of the Appalachian since, and I never will. I don't know what we saw standing in that upstairs window. I don't know who she was, why her cries seemed to move through the forest the way they did, or why that smile terrified both of us so completely. All I know is that weeks have passed, and neither my wife nor I have been able to get those screams out of our heads. Sometimes, late at night, when the house is completely quiet, I still catch myself thinking I can hear them somewhere in the distance. It's almost as if whatever we encountered out there never really stayed behind in those mountains. Somehow, it came home with us.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
All of this happened too many years ago, and it happened to me and my father, although I only truly understood what had happened much later, because at the time I was young, and things back then were very different from what they are now. It was only years later that my father finally told me the truth about that night. We lived in the Appalachian Mountains, in an area that nowadays gets a fair amount of tourism because it sits near one of the entrances to one of the more well-known hiking trails. But back then, tourism had barely started, and the Appalachians were still deeply isolated. I am not saying they are not isolated today, because there are still places out here where people live incredibly cut-off lives. But the area where I grew up changed a lot over the years. Tourists arrived, roads improved, more people started passing through. I would not even say that change was entirely good or entirely bad. Like most things, it came with both sides of the coin. On one hand, supplies reached us faster, there was more diversity, more people from different places, and I think there is something healthy about that. On the other hand, tourism, when people do not respect the land, destroys habitats, damages the forest. And over the years, we started seeing more trash left behind on trails. A lot of people simply do not respect the woods. Park rangers spend half their time cleaning up messes that should never exist in the first place. Anyway, my point is simply that the place where this happened no longer feels like the same world. Because back then, our town was completely isolated, and even the forest itself was a place most people avoided. There were countless stories circulating when I was growing up, especially stories passed down from my grandparents' generation. Stories about people who lived deep in the woods. And I am not talking about the kind of people mention nowadays. Drug operations or criminals hiding out in remote areas. Those exist too, sure. But that is not what I mean. I mean people who had separated themselves from society entirely. People who lived by their own rules, with habits and customs that seemed strange to everyone else. The truth is, most of us knew some of these people existed. and for the most part, there was an unspoken agreement. We left them alone, and they left us alone. In fact, my father and I had once even been helped by one of them before. So, I do not want this story to sound like some kind of attack against people who choose to live outside society. That is not what this is. We genuinely believed that whatever was happening out there had nothing to do with those people. We believed there was some kind of cult operating in those mountains at the time. So, getting directly into the story, now that the context makes more sense, I was 9 years old when this happened. My father, my grandfather, even my mother and grandmother were all people who depended heavily on the forest. A huge amount of what we ate came from the woods. Plants, herbs, mushrooms, roots, things most people nowadays would walk right past without recognizing. My grandparents especially knew the forest in ways that honestly felt almost impossible. They knew which herbs could kill you within minutes and which ones could heal you. They knew how to cook things safely, how to preserve them, how to recognize danger just from smell or color. Because of that, my father and I spent a lot of time gathering mushrooms together. And it was during one of those trips that my father suddenly suggested that we head back home, drop off the mushrooms, and come back 2 days later to spend a couple nights camping in the mountains. It was going to be my first time camping with him. My parents had done it many times before while I was younger, but I had always stayed behind with my grandparents. I had never gone with them, so to me, it felt almost like a rite of passage. It felt like my father had finally decided I was old enough to handle it, old enough to be trusted out there with him, old enough to understand the rules of the forest. I remember being incredibly excited. And I also remember my father immediately shutting that excitement down before it could fully show on my face. He told me the forest was not a place for excitement. It was not a place for showing off or pretending to be brave. He reminded me that in the woods, instinct mattered more than pride. If he told me to do something, I had to do it immediately. No hesitation, no questions. I understood what he meant, even if I was still thrilled inside. The forest was full of dangers. And unlike outsiders, people who grew up there understood that a lot of the old stories existed for a reason. When we got home and handed the mushrooms over to my mother, we told her we would be leaving for the mountains the next morning. I could immediately tell she was uneasy about it. She tried not to show it too much, but I saw the worry on her face. Still, my mother was never the kind of person who stopped me from growing. She believed people had to experience things for themselves, and if I got hurt, then I could always come back home afterward. She only interfered when she truly believed there was immediate danger. Since I was going with my father, and she trusted him completely, all she really did was give us that look that silently begged us to be careful before letting us go. We started our trip early the following morning. Like I said, I was unbelievably excited because we were finally entering a section of the forest I had never been allowed into before. That area had always been completely off limits to me unless I was with my parents. It was not like I had never been in the woods before. I had gone mushroom hunting with friends plenty of times, but never alone, and never anywhere near that part of the mountains. The moment we crossed into that section of forest, I immediately felt something shift. The air itself felt different. The woods were darker there. The trees were thicker, taller, closer together. The sounds of the forest seemed louder somehow, layered on top of each other until it almost sounded alive. It genuinely felt like we had stepped into the heart of the mountains themselves. I was completely mesmerized by it all. I was a child seeing an entirely new world for the first time. And despite my father's warnings, I could barely contain how amazed I was. But around 3 hours later, things started changing. We had been moving slowly because I was still small, and my father constantly had to slow his pace so I could keep up. So realistically, it would probably have only taken an adult about half that time to cover the same distance. I remember noticing my father becoming tense. At first it was subtle. His shoulders tightened slightly, and he started stopping more often to listen. Then I realized the sounds around us were changing too. Certain noises in the forest seemed unnaturally loud, while others had almost completely disappeared. My father quietly told me he thought there might be an animal nearby, and because of that, I needed to stay close to him, stay calm, and not panic no matter what happened. Then he asked me if I smelled something strange, and I did. It was a rotten smell, thick, wet, almost sweet in the worst possible way. A smell so heavy it seemed to stick to the back of my throat. That was when I realized the sound I had been hearing was not just insects in general. It was flies, thousands of them. The buzzing was so loud it sounded almost mechanical, like standing beside an overflowing dumpster during the middle of summer. My father told me to stay where I was while he moved ahead between two large trees where I could no longer fully see him. I knew where he was standing, but only barely. Through the gaps between the trunks, I could only make out the back of his head and part of his shoulders. Then I saw him look down at something on the ground. He immediately raised a hand over his mouth, as if trying to stop himself from reacting out loud. And in that exact moment, I watched his entire body posture change. I remember calling out to him, asking what was going on, and the way he answered me actually scared me a little at the time. His voice came out sharp, almost aggressive. Although looking back now, considering the situation, I completely understand why. He told me to stay exactly where I was, then immediately walked back over to me. He explained that he had found a dead animal and that it might be part of some hunting area, and because of that, he was worried a hunter could accidentally mistake us for targets if we stayed there too long. So, he told me we needed to move away from that part of the forest immediately, and that we might even have to turn back entirely. At the time, I got upset in the way children do when they do not understand what is happening. I started complaining, whining about the trip ending before it had even really started. Obviously, now I know my father had been lying to protect me. What he had actually found was not an animal at all. It was a person. Years later, when my father finally explained everything to me, he told me the state of the body had been horrifying beyond words. It was immediately obvious that someone had done that intentionally. Parts of the skin were missing entirely, removed with enough precision that my father became physically sick the moment he saw it. I still remember him telling me years later that the thing that disturbed him the most was not even the violence itself, but the realization that somebody had deliberately taken pieces of skin from the body as if they were collecting material for something. But back then I knew none of this. I was just a child complaining because I thought my father was overreacting, until eventually he had to firmly remind me that he was in charge, and that if he said we were leaving, then we were leaving. So we turned around and started walking back the way we had come. We had not even been moving for 2 full minutes before we saw her. She was sitting in the distance between the trees, perfectly still at first, almost blending into the woods themselves. Even now, I can remember her clearly. She was wearing a dress that looked ancient, stained and worn down as if it had been used for years without ever being properly cleaned. Her hair was incredibly long, hanging almost all the way down to the forest floor, and although it looked recently washed, there was something uncared for about it, something wild. She was hunched over whatever was in front of her, her back bent at an unnatural angle, while she focused entirely on something she was doing on the ground. My father stopped instantly. A second later, the woman noticed us standing there and slowly turned toward us. That was when we saw her hands. They were completely red. At first, to my 9-year-old mind, it almost looked like paint. But even then, some part of me understood it was blood. Her fingers moved carefully and repeatedly in small, precise motions, and it genuinely looked as though she was sewing something together. At the time, I could not process what I was seeing, but my father understood immediately. The moment he saw the stitching motion and the blood covering her hands, he connected it to the body he had just found and realized what she was using as material. I remember my father's reaction perfectly because he was never an aggressive man, never somebody who threatened people. But I watched him point directly at her while speaking in a voice I had never heard from him before. He warned her not to come any closer. He told her to stay exactly where she was. He said we had ways to protect ourselves, that we were not going to tell anyone anything, that we were simply leaving and going back the way we came. I had absolutely no idea what was happening. I had not understood what she was sewing. I had only seen her blood-covered hands and the look on my father's face. But he was my father, and I trusted him completely, so we turned around immediately and started moving as fast as I could manage through the trees. When we finally reached a slightly more open section of forest, my father told me to run, so I ran. After a while, I physically could not keep up anymore, and without saying anything, he grabbed me, threw me onto his back, and started carrying me while running himself. I still remember the sound of his breathing, completely out of breath, panicked, pushing himself harder than I had ever seen before. Even though I still did not fully understand the danger we were in, his reaction alone was enough to terrify me. Children know when adults are genuinely afraid, and my father was terrified. Because of that, I stayed completely silent for the rest of the journey. Eventually, we reached the section of forest I already recognized, the safer part near the areas where people actually traveled. My father finally put me back down and told me we needed to keep walking as fast as possible until we reached the town again. Once we got home, he left me with my mother and said he needed to speak with the police. I kept asking him what was happening, and every single time he told me not to worry, that everything was fine, that he just needed to confirm something with the sheriff. But of course, everything was not fine. He reported everything he had seen in the woods, and years later, he finally told me the truth about what had happened. The woman had genuinely been sewing with human skin. Apparently, a massive investigation followed, or at least as massive as something like that could have been in such an isolated area over 40 years ago. People have to understand what life was like out there back then. We barely had resources. The local sheriff's department was tiny and completely unequipped for something that serious. My father told me some federal people eventually arrived, though he never fully understood who they were. He was not the kind of man who cared much about government agencies, so he simply accepted whoever showed up without asking questions. As far as I know, the case was never solved. Nobody ever identified the person my father found in the forest because the body itself was never recovered. It disappeared before authorities could return to the exact location. There had always been disappearances in that region, and honestly, there still are, although not nearly as many now that the area has become more populated with hikers, tourists, and park rangers. Back then, people disappeared all the time. That was just something people quietly learned to live with. Sometimes families did not even report it because they assumed the person had simply gotten tired of their old life and left on purpose. So the story faded over time without ever truly being resolved. My father passed away around 6 years ago now, and even today, this story still chills me in a way I cannot properly explain. The idea that there were people operating in those forests with habits so grotesque and inhuman still sits in the back of my mind every time I hike through those mountains. I still live in the same region, and I still spend a lot of time in the woods, but every single time I pass through that area, which today looks completely harmless with its maintained trail and scenic viewpoints, I cannot stop thinking about what happened there 40 years ago. Most people walking that trail today have absolutely no idea what used to exist in those mountains. I've always been a bit contradictory when it comes to how I live. Ever since I was a kid, I've had this constant push and pull between two kinds of anxiety that don't really cancel each other out. On one side, I've always felt uncomfortable in places with too many people, cities especially, where everything feels too close, too loud, too immediate. On the other side, complete isolation has never exactly felt natural either. So, I ended up building my life somewhere in between those two extremes, trying to avoid both of them as much as possible. If I had to be honest, the fear of social environments was always the stronger one. That's probably why, when I finally moved out of my parents' house in West Virginia, I didn't hesitate for long between my options. One place was closer to town, surrounded by people I already knew, including a few who I had grown up with and who never really treated me well. I didn't want to be anywhere near that. The other option was further out, much more isolated, surrounded by forest and distance, where the only real sound most days was wind and whatever animals passed through. I chose the second one. At first it wasn't comfortable. I won't pretend it was. Living alone in a place like that changes the way you experience silence. It becomes something physical, almost like pressure. But over time, something shifted. The lack of constant interaction stopped feeling like emptiness and started feeling like control. No unexpected conversations, no obligations, no presence I didn't choose. My work also helped with that. I work online, I set my own deadlines, I don't answer to coworkers or fixed schedules, so my days are entirely mine. I don't really follow a typical structure, and I don't interact with many people at all. The only real constant in my life is one of my closest friends from childhood. He understands the way I am, never pushed me to be different, and honestly, he's similar in a lot of ways. Apart from that, my parents are still around, but contact is limited and simple. That's pretty much it. I don't really keep up with much outside of what I choose to watch online. Most of the time, it's just YouTube videos or random updates about things happening in the world, but even that feels distant and, strangely enough, That's the version of life I've always been most comfortable with. That's why what I'm about to describe caught me completely off guard. It was around 4 in the morning. I was in the kitchen, preparing a small snack before going to bed, something I've done countless times without thinking about it. While I was there, I had this brief feeling, almost like a shift in air inside the house. The kind of sensation that makes you instinctively check doors and windows even if nothing obvious is wrong. So, I did a quick walk through the house. Everything looked fine, locked and closed, exactly how it always is before I go to sleep. Nothing stood out, nothing seemed off. I remember thinking it was probably just my imagination, maybe fatigue, and I went back upstairs. I sat down in bed with my snack and picked up a book. I barely got through 10 pages. Not even that, maybe less. I remember looking at the clock at some point and thinking it was around 4:15, maybe a little later. After that, everything feels like it collapses into a very short gap of time. I didn't even feel myself fall asleep properly. I just remember waking up, but it wasn't gradual. There was no confusion, no slow return to awareness. It was immediate, sharp, like something had pulled me out of sleep. My body reacted before my mind, and the first thing I noticed was sound of footsteps. Not outside the house, but inside, coming down the hallway. Slow at first, then clearer, as if whoever it was had stopped trying to be quiet. And then I heard my bedroom door. The handle moved. Just once at first, a slight test, like someone checking if it would open. That was the moment my body reacted without permission. I rolled instinctively, completely disoriented, lost my balance, and ended up on the floor beside my bed without even understanding how I got there. The instinct wasn't to look or confirm anything. It was purely survival. I stayed low, pressed against the floor, facing the doorway from underneath the bed frame. From that angle, I could still see part of the room and the door. I remember waiting for it to open. That part is hard to explain properly, because in moments like that, time doesn't feel continuous. It stretches, breaks, and slows down in a way that makes every second feel separate from the next. I was convinced the door was going to swing open at any moment, but it didn't. The footsteps changed direction instead. They started moving away from the door. And then nothing. There was silence again. I stayed where I was for a long time. Long enough that my body started shaking from the aftermath rather than the fear itself. I don't know exactly how long it was, but at some point I became aware that I was still waiting for something that wasn't coming. Eventually, I forced myself out from under the bed. I turned on every light in the house, one by one, and checked every room. Nothing looked disturbed, and nothing was missing. Nothing had changed except the attic door. It was open. I don't know how to explain that part properly. I don't remember it being open before going to bed, and I certainly don't use it often. In fact, I hadn't touched it in a long time. But it was open enough that I couldn't ignore it. I checked it carefully, but there was nothing inside that suggested what had just happened. I replaced the lock the next day without hesitation. I went into town for it, even though I normally avoid doing that unless absolutely necessary. I hate going into town. Too many people, too much noise, too much everything. But I didn't want to risk ignoring it. For a few days after that, I barely slept properly. Every small sound in the house felt huge. I kept expecting it to happen again, even though logically there was no reason for it to. About a week later, I was walking near my property, but more on the forest side when I heard movement nearby. When I turned, I saw a man standing there. He looked wrong is probably the simplest way to put it. Unkempt, disoriented, like someone who hadn't been taking care of himself for a long time. When he spoke, he was smiling. He said something along the lines of, almost casually, like he was commenting on the weather, that he had scared me pretty well the other night. I didn't stay there. I told him to back away immediately. My voice came out sharper than I expected, and I remember telling him that if he tried anything again, he wouldn't be lucky twice. Then I left. I got back to my car and drove straight to the police station. I filed a report. I didn't try to interpret anything at that point. I just described what had happened as clearly as I could. A couple of days later, I found out he had been caught doing something similar at another property nearby. This time, the homeowner managed to detain him until the police arrived. He's in custody now, as far as I know, but something in me didn't fully settle with it. Even though I know there's a rational explanation, even though I know the situation was resolved, my sense of isolation never quite returned to what it was before. It's still there, just not as quiet as it used to be. I have a job that most people would probably describe as morbid, although to me it has always felt more like a quiet extension of something human rather than anything strange or dark. I learned it from my girlfriend about 10 years ago, and now, in a slightly different form, we both still do it. She leans more toward vintage clothing, things that carry history in fabric and texture, while I tend to deal more with objects in general, the kind of things people leave behind when a life ends and nobody quite knows what to do with the weight of it all. What we do, in simple terms, is handle estates after someone passes away. Sometimes we are contacted directly by families, sometimes we reach out ourselves after going through obituaries. But the core idea is always the same. We help clear out homes in a way that tries to be as gentle as possible. Not everything is about value or resale. First and foremost, we go through everything carefully, return whatever the family wants to keep, make sure personal items are treated with respect, and only after that do we deal with what remains. Furniture, clothing, household objects, things that no one in the family wants or is able to take with them, those are what we eventually recover and resell. I know some people find that uncomfortable, and I understand why they might, but we've always tried to approach it in a way that feels more like preservation than disposal, like giving objects a second life instead of letting them disappear without acknowledgement. This particular job started like most others, at least on paper. A family had contacted us about their grandmother who had passed away roughly 2 months earlier. The funeral had already been arranged, everything formal had been handled, but the house itself was still untouched. It was located in a fairly isolated part of the Appalachian region, far enough out that the family themselves couldn't easily travel there. And they specifically asked us to retrieve certain personal items, mainly photographs and letters that had sentimental value. The rest of the contents of the house were ours to go through, and anything we deemed usable or valuable we could keep and resell. Work like that usually carries a certain expectation with it. Older homes in remote areas tend to hold objects that have been passed down for generations, sometimes unexpectedly valuable, sometimes just deeply personal. So, I'll admit, I was genuinely looking forward to it in that quiet, practical way that comes with experience. Not excitement exactly, but anticipation. The kind of mindset where you expect to find stories embedded in objects. The arrangement was straightforward. I would go there first, spend a few days going through the house and organizing everything, and my girlfriend, who is now my wife, would join me later to focus specifically on the clothing and textiles. That part of the process is usually more delicate, more emotional in a way, so she tends to handle it with more care than I do. In this case, I was the one who went ahead alone, since everything had already been coordinated with the family, and payment had been made in advance for the retrieval of specific items. What I didn't expect, and what I still struggle to explain clearly even now, is how quickly that sense of routine broke down once I arrived. The house was even more isolated than I had anticipated. The moment I entered the area, I realized there was no reception at all, which wasn't entirely unusual for that region, but still enough to make things feel slightly disconnected. I had the address though, and even without GPS, I'm fairly comfortable navigating with maps and landmarks, so I continued until I was certain I was in the right place. The structure matched the description, and everything about it seemed consistent with what I had been told. But when I pulled up, there was someone already there. An elderly woman sitting on the porch. For a moment, I genuinely thought I had made a mistake. It wouldn't have been the first time an address led to confusion in rural areas where properties aren't clearly marked. So I double-checked mentally, then stepped out of the car and approached carefully. I asked her if I had the right place, if she was related to the family I had spoken with, or if I had somehow ended up at the wrong property entirely. She didn't answer immediately. She just looked at me for a long time. Not hostile and not welcoming either, just measured, like she was trying to decide how to interpret my presence. I gave her the space to respond, assuming she might simply be hard of hearing or slow to process the question. Eventually, she told me I hadn't made a mistake. This was the right house. And then she said something that didn't fit into anything I had been told or believed. She said she was the owner, that she wasn't dead, and that her family had always had a habit of telling people she was, essentially clearing out parts of her life under that assumption. The way she said it wasn't angry. It wasn't dramatic either. It was tired, almost resigned, like the statement had been repeated in her mind too many times to carry shock anymore. But hearing it in that context, standing there at the edge of the porch, immediately shifted something in me. It wasn't just confusion anymore. It was pure discomfort. I explained why I was there, carefully, trying not to assume anything. I told her about the family's request, the photographs, the letters, the agreement we had been given. Her response surprised me even more than her first statement. She didn't object. She didn't deny the arrangement. Instead, she simply said there was no problem, that if I needed to take things, I could take whatever I wanted, and that it didn't really matter anymore whether she was officially considered alive or not. That moment is hard to describe properly because it didn't feel like consent in the normal sense. It felt like detachment, like she had already separated herself from the idea that the house belonged to her in any meaningful way. I remember standing there longer than I should have, unsure of how to proceed. There was a strong sense of unease, not because anything overtly threatening had happened, but because the entire situation felt ethically unstable. I even suggested, carefully, that I could cancel the job, return the payment, and inform the family that I wouldn't proceed under these circumstances. She declined, just calmly, as if the outcome didn't matter either way. She told me I could stay, do what I needed to do, and leave when I was finished. There was no resistance, no urgency, nothing that made the situation easier to categorize. And because I had already been paid, and because I was physically there with no immediate way to contact anyone, I stayed. Not comfortably, not confidently, but out of obligation mixed with uncertainty. I know I should have gone back and called the family, but honestly, I didn't know what to do. Nothing like that had ever happened to me before, and I just froze. On top of that, she kept insisting that I come in, as if she really needed me to, like she didn't want to be alone again. I decided I would stay for a little while, assess the situation better, and then I just kept staying, without really knowing why. Over the next few days, I worked through the house slowly. I focused on what the family had specifically requested first, the photographs and letters, carefully sorting them and setting them aside, always asking if it was okay to take those things. I also came across a few additional objects that the woman identified as old and potentially meaningful, and I set those aside as well. Everything else I mostly left untouched. It didn't feel right to approach it as a typical clearance job anymore. The woman herself remained in the house throughout. She rarely spoke. When she did, it was brief, sometimes almost fragmented, like conversation required more effort than she was willing to spend. There were long stretches where she would simply sit in a room without acknowledging anything happening around her, and I found myself trying, unsuccessfully, to interpret whether that was due to age, exhaustion, or something deeper tied to the situation she had described. By the third day, I had started to feel less like I was working in a house, and more like I was moving through someone else's suspended life, trying not to disturb anything that might already be too fragile to touch. And I had started noticing two things I couldn't easily explain away. At first, I tried very hard to rationalize both of them, because the alternative felt uncomfortable in a way I didn't want to sit with. The first was the temperature. Every time she entered a room I was in, the air would shift slightly. Not in a way that could be immediately measured or proven, but enough that I would pause without meaning to. It was like a thin layer of cold settling into the space, subtle at first, then lingering just long enough for me to become aware of it. I told myself it was probably the house itself. Old structures in the Appalachians do that, especially in places where insulation is poor and drafts move through the walls in ways you don't immediately notice. I also told myself it was psychological, that I was already uncomfortable with the situation, and my body was simply reacting to that discomfort by amplifying every small sensation. The second thing was quieter, but harder to ignore once I noticed it. The house creaked constantly under my steps. The floors were old wood, uneven in places, the kind that announce every movement. I had gotten used to it quickly, but she never made a sound, not once. When she moved through the same hallways, when she entered or left a room, there was no creak, no shift in pressure through the floorboards. At first, I thought I was simply missing it. But after a while, it became something I actively paid attention to, and still, nothing ever registered. I know that, being a man and probably weighing 3 times as much as she did, that would make a significant difference. Even so, she should have made some kind of noise, no matter how slight. I found myself getting startled all the time because I would suddenly see her there without ever hearing her come in. She would just appear behind me like a ghost. She also never joined me for meals. I would cook for myself, and then I would prepare a portion for her and bring it to wherever she was sitting. She would accept it without much conversation, sometimes with a small nod, sometimes without any acknowledgement at all. Then she would remain in her own space while I ate alone. I never actually saw her eat, not properly. There were moments where I would pass by later and the food would be gone, but I never caught her in the act of sitting down to a meal. By the end of the 3rd day, I made the decision to leave. I thanked her for letting me stay, even though the wording felt inadequate for what the experience had been. I apologized for any disruption I might have caused, even though I wasn't entirely sure what I was apologizing for. Then I packed my things and left the house, driving a considerable distance down the dirt road before I finally got reception again. The moment my phone connected, I called my wife and told her not to come. I didn't have a clear explanation at that point, only that something about the situation felt fundamentally wrong in a way I couldn't properly articulate over the phone. Shortly after, I also contacted the family again, specifically the grandson who had originally arranged the work. I told him it had been an uncomfortable experience, that I had stayed longer than intended, and that I wasn't sure the situation inside the house had been as straightforward as they had described. I expected confusion, maybe dismissal, or at least questions. Instead, his response was immediate and direct. He told me she was dead. Not metaphorically, not ambiguously. He said they had proof, and then he sent me the obituary. I remember standing there looking at my phone for a long time without fully processing what I was reading. It wasn't shock in the normal sense. It was something quieter and more disorienting, like my mind refusing to align 2 versions of the same reality. Because part of me, despite everything, had the clear impression that I had been interacting with someone in that house. And at the same time, another part of me could no longer reconcile that with what I was now seeing on the screen. I drove home in silence. I don't remember much of the journey itself, only the feeling of trying to hold 2 explanations in my head at once, neither of which fully satisfied what I had experienced. When I arrived, I told my wife everything. We didn't try to immediately assign meaning to it. We just acknowledged how strange it was and left it at that for a while, because anything more concrete felt impossible at the time. For a couple of days afterward, I tried to distance myself from it mentally, but that didn't really work. The house kept coming back into my thoughts in small fragments, not as a single coherent memory, but as isolated details that didn't quite fit together. The cold shifts in rooms, the silence of her movements, the way the space felt occupied, even when nothing visibly confirmed it. Eventually, I decided to reach out again, this time to another member of the family. a granddaughter who responded with more openness than I expected. She spoke about her grandmother with a kind of sadness that didn't feel rehearsed. She told me the family situation had never been simple, that the grandmother had insisted on staying in that house for most of her life, even when it became increasingly difficult for anyone to regularly visit her. There was regret in her words, but not hostility, more like someone trying to make sense of distance after the fact. She assured me she would go to the property herself, that she would look into everything properly, and that whatever had been left unresolved would be addressed with care. The way she said it stayed with me. The whole situation was sad, and I felt heartbroken for that old lady. About 2 months later, I received another message from her. She said she had gone to the house, that she and another relative had spent time there, and that they believed they had managed to give her peace. Whatever that meant in practical terms. She didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. Even now, years later, I still think about that place more often than I would like to admit. I continued doing the same kind of work after that, although not in exactly the same way. Something in me shifted after that experience. I think I can honestly say that, regardless of what happened in that house, I was never the same again. Before I get into what actually happened, I should probably say that I've been meaning to share this for a long time. I've been following this channel for years, almost since it first started, but I never felt confident enough to submit anything because I always worried I wouldn't get the details right, or that I would end up over-explaining the wrong parts and underplaying the ones that actually matter. Over time, I found myself paying attention to how other people tell their stories here, how they pace things, what they choose to include, what they leave out, and I tried to shape my own account around that. I'm not saying this to make anyone think it's fabricated. If anything, it's the opposite. I just know that I might go a bit heavier on certain details from that time than most people would. But in my mind, those details are exactly what makes it real, or at least as close as I can get to describing it properly. So, I've decided to just tell it the way I remember it, without trying to filter too much of it out. With that said, what I'm about to share is one of the most intense and disturbing periods of my life. I'll do my best to explain it as clearly and honestly as I can. My name is Mickey, and although nowadays I am an older man and probably a little more mature when it comes to taking risks, back when I was younger, I was exactly the kind of guy you would expect someone in their early 20s to be. I made impulsive decisions. I rarely thought things through properly, and I walked around with that stupid feeling young men sometimes have, where they believe nothing bad can really happen to them. You probably know the type of person I mean. Most of us have met someone like that at some point, or maybe we were that person ourselves once. Some of you listening might even still be in that phase now, and I do not mean that as criticism. It is normal. What I am trying to explain is that a lot of the things I would immediately recognize today as warning signs barely even registered in my mind back then. Another reason why everything that happened caught me completely off guard was because I was not somebody who grew up in isolated places. I had lived in the city my entire life, and honestly, I still do. The Appalachian Mountains were only a brief chapter of my life, although definitely the most terrifying one. They were never truly my world. I did not grow up hearing local legends, and I certainly did not believe forests could hold things people did not fully understand. To me, stories like that were entertaining at best. Looking back now, I realize how unprepared I really was. And most of that came from my age and from the environment I was used to. In the city, I knew how to recognize danger quickly. You learn to read people, situations, streets, sounds. But the mountains are different, completely different. And unless you have actually spent time out there, it is difficult to explain just how different they really are. This happened in the early 90s. I was 22 years old at the time, and college had never even been a realistic possibility for me. My parents were poor, and I had been working since I was young just to survive. I bounced between different jobs for years until I eventually ended up taking this one, and honestly, I was excited when I got hired. The work mostly involved maintenance and inspection duties in sections of the Appalachian trails. Nowadays, a lot of that work is handled directly by park rangers or people with more formal training, but back then, private companies still handled parts of it because tourism had started increasing and the state needed extra workers. I was one of the few people who managed to get that kind of job while it still existed. Most of my days followed the exact same routine once I arrived in the mountains. Every morning I would head into the forest, spend the day checking trails, replacing damaged signs, inspecting old structures, clearing debris from paths, and then return in the evening. I was staying in a small rental house with 4 other guys who were doing the same work. Day after day, we went out together and came back together. Most of the time we worked in groups because one of the company policies was to avoid being alone in the forest whenever possible, which honestly made sense. Something as simple as twisting an ankle out there could quickly become a serious situation. The problem was that we did not always follow those rules very carefully. Most of us were young, impatient, and more interested in finishing the work quickly so we could relax afterward. People would naturally drift apart during the day, especially once everybody became comfortable with the area. Another thing that eventually contributed to everything that happened was that after a while, I genuinely started disliking the other guys I worked with. I felt like they had absolutely no respect for the forest. To them, it was just another temporary job. If they saw trash on the ground, they ignored it. Sometimes they added to it themselves. One of them nearly hurt an animal once, and I still honestly do not know what he planned to do because I stopped him before anything happened. It was that kind of behavior, the kind that immediately tells you somebody does not belong in a place like that. They did not respect the mountains, and because of that, I slowly started distancing myself from them. I was never the kind of person who stayed quiet when I saw things I considered wrong, so there were arguments, tension, stupid fights over little things. Eventually, I mostly kept to myself. I would do my work, come back to the house, sleep, and avoid them whenever possible. The job lasted 4 months straight, and I would say things started changing around the 2-month mark, once I had become comfortable enough in the forest to stop treating it cautiously. Around that time, I also became more interested in the local stories connected to the mountains. Not because I believed them, but because I found them entertaining. There are countless legends tied to the Appalachians, especially once you spend enough time around people who actually grew up there. Most of the older locals spoke about the forest in a way that almost made it sound alive. Again, I never took any of it seriously. Part of my work involved occasionally checking on an old fire lookout tower deep in one section of the mountains. The structure still technically belonged to the state, even though it had been abandoned for decades. So, every once in a while, somebody had to make sure it was still standing and had not become dangerous. There were times when hikers or hunters used it for shelter, which was completely normal. And whenever somebody was already staying there, I would simply leave them alone and come back another day. Most of the time, though, the tower was empty. Tourism still was not particularly heavy in that area during the early 90s, and the lookout itself looked old enough that many people probably avoided sleeping there altogether. The structure creaked constantly when the wind hit it, and from a distance, it honestly looked like the kind of place that could collapse if you leaned on the wrong wall. It was during one of those nights at the lookout, probably the third time I had decided to stay there overnight, that things began happening. Originally, I had not even planned to spend the night there. My intention was to finish my inspection and head back before dark. But toward the end of the afternoon, an enormous wall of fog started rolling through the forest around the tower. I mean the kind of fog that completely swallows the mountains. You could stand near the edge of the platform and barely see beyond the trees directly below you. Even back then, before I took any of the local stories seriously, I knew enough to understand that a lot of Appalachian legends are tied to fog. I remember feeling uneasy in a way I could not really explain, so instead of risking the trails after dark, I decided to stay inside the lookout until morning. I locked the door, settled in, and tried to relax. Normally when I planned to spend the night there, I brought something to keep myself occupied, usually a book or magazines. But that night, I had absolutely nothing with me. So for the first time since finding the tower, I started properly exploring every corner of the place just to kill time. I checked drawers, storage compartments, shelves, anything I had ignored during previous visits. Eventually, I noticed that one section of wall beside the old desk looked slightly loose, almost as if somebody had pried it open before. When I pushed against it, I realized there was a narrow hidden space between the inner and outer walls of the tower. Inside that space was a small portable cassette recorder along with several old tapes. From what I could piece together afterward, the recordings had belonged to one of the last fire watchers stationed there sometime in the late 50s. Another watcher disappeared a few years later during the 60s. And not long after that, the station was permanently abandoned. Most of the tapes were damaged. Some sections cut out entirely, while others were buried under static. But little by little, I started understanding fragments of what the man had been documenting. Many of the recordings mentioned fog. Not normal fog exactly, but heavy waves of it moving through the forest in ways that deeply unsettled him. He kept talking about men walking through the woods during those nights, men who only seemed to appear when the fog became thick enough to hide the mountains entirely. At first, I misunderstood what he meant. Honestly, my first assumption was that he was talking about hunters. Strange hunters maybe, but still just hunters. I figured there were probably groups who preferred tracking animals in those conditions because it made things more difficult or more exciting. Weird, sure, but people form hobbies around all kinds of things. That was my thinking in the beginning. But the more recordings I managed to piece together, the more uncomfortable I started feeling. I started noticing a pattern in some of the recordings. The man speaking was clearly under an unbelievable amount of stress. Several times he sounded like he was begging something for help, although because of the damage on the tapes, I could never fully understand who he was talking to. or what exactly was happening around him. But one thing became increasingly clear the more I listened. He was not describing a group of hunters moving through the fog. He kept referring to one specific person, one man. Or at least he believed it was a man. There was one recording in particular that stuck with me more than any of the others. His voice sounded exhausted, shaky, like somebody who had not slept properly in days. And I remember hearing him say that he was absolutely certain the man in the fog was not hunting animals. He was hunting people. Even then, I still could not fully process what I was listening to. Part of me wondered if the tapes were some kind of joke left behind by previous workers. Another part of me thought maybe the man had simply lost his mind from isolation after spending too long alone in those mountains. But regardless of what explanation I tried giving myself, I eventually had to stop listening for a while because I could physically feel my anxiety getting worse. The fear in his voice was starting to affect me. It felt less like I was listening to somebody tell a story and more like I was slowly being pulled directly into whatever he had experienced out there. As most people know, fire lookouts are built with windows on almost every side, so you can see for miles across the mountains. And sitting there in the darkness, I could clearly watch the fog growing thicker around the forest below me. At some point, I noticed something that immediately made my stomach drop. There was a light moving through the fog. At first, I assumed it was just a flashlight belonging to another hiker, or maybe somebody moving through the woods at night. But it was already completely dark outside by then, and the fog had only become heavier. That was when I suddenly remembered one specific thing the man on the recordings had said. He mentioned that if he ever saw somebody outside during the fog, he immediately shut off every light inside the tower, so nobody would know he was there. Thankfully, I had already done exactly that. The moment I heard him say it earlier in the recordings, something about the way he spoke had unsettled me enough that I instinctively turned off all the lights in the lookout. So by that point, the tower looked completely abandoned from outside. I stayed as low and quiet as possible while watching the light move slowly through the trees below me. Then I heard two things that genuinely terrified me more than anything I had experienced up until that moment. First, I heard a gunshot. And almost immediately after that, I heard somebody scream. Not an animal, but a person. At nearly the exact same moment, the light I had been watching suddenly started moving quickly through the fog, rushing toward wherever the scream had come from. That was the moment I stopped caring whether the recordings were real or not. Someone was hunting in those woods, and whoever had screamed had not been attacked by an animal. I did not stop to think any further after that. I grabbed the few things I had brought with me, threw open the door of the lookout, and started running through the forest in the opposite direction from the gunshot and the light. I did not use a flashlight. I tried making as little noise as possible while still moving as fast as I could through the trees. I remember falling multiple times. I scraped my arms and legs badly against branches and rocks. At one point, I even hit my head hard enough that I probably should have stopped to recover, but the adrenaline completely took over, and I just kept running. I honestly do not even know how long I kept moving through those woods before daylight finally started appearing. By the next morning, I had reached an area I did not recognize at all. I was completely lost, exhausted, dehydrated, and honestly close to panicking again. But luckily, I came across a couple camping nearby. They were experienced hikers, and the moment they saw the state I was in, they immediately helped me without hesitation, which honestly says a lot, because people who spend enough time in isolated forests sometimes avoid getting involved in situations like that out of fear for their own safety. They gave me water, helped me calm down, and eventually walked me back toward a neighboring access road where they had parked their truck. From there, they drove me all the way back to the town where I had been staying. Once I got back, I reported everything to the local sheriff. I told him I had heard a gunshot deep in the forest, followed by somebody screaming. He said they would look into it, although, as far as I know, nothing ever came from it. At least, nothing I was ever told about. Afterward, I started hearing stories from some of the locals, especially older people who had lived in the area most of their lives. I never returned to that section of the forest again, and from that moment forward, I also stopped wandering away from the other workers whenever we were out on trails. What I eventually learned was that the area around that fire lookout had a long history of disappearances attached to it. There were very few official records left behind, because this had happened during a period when documentation in isolated areas was inconsistent at best. Most of what still exists today survives only through local stories passed down by people who remember hearing about it from older relatives. There is almost nothing formal you can actually look up or verify. Eventually, the job ended, and I never once considered applying for anything like it again. I warned as many people as I could to stay away from that section of the mountains. I usually told them there were reckless hunters in the area and that somebody could easily get shot by mistake. I never told anybody the full truth because I knew exactly how insane it would sound. And honestly, even today, I still do not fully understand what was happening out there. I do not know if it was something supernatural. I do not know if it was simply a man who had been living in those forests for decades and used the fog to hunt people without ever being seen properly. I have no explanation. What still disturbs me is the fact that the man who made those recordings had been there over 30 years before I arrived, which means whatever he encountered may have still been there all that time later. I have replayed this story in my head countless times over the years, trying to make sense of it, and I still cannot. I never returned to the Appalachians after that job ended, and even now, decades later, hearing the name of those mountains still gives me chills. It was probably the most exciting period of my life. That part is true. But it was also the most terrifying.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
All of this happened about a year ago, and the only reason I'm telling it now is because that time of year is coming around again. The same kind of holiday, the same kind of place. And the truth is that we've never really been able to look at it the same way since. Because what happened there didn't just stay there. It followed us home in ways I didn't expect, especially with my youngest, who even now struggles to sleep alone, who asks for the lights to stay on, who wakes up in the middle of the night, as if she's listening for something she doesn't want to hear again. I'm not telling you this to scare you for the sake of it. I'm telling you because I made a mistake, one that I think a lot of parents make without even realizing it. Because we're used to being told that children imagine things, that they exaggerate, that they invent stories to get attention, and sometimes that's true, but sometimes it isn't. And the problem is that if you dismiss everything as imagination, you might miss the one time when it isn't. I always considered myself a good father. My wife would say the same about herself as a mother. And like anyone raising children, we do our best, even when we're tired, even when we don't have much left to give, because being a parent means constantly giving parts of yourself away. But there are moments when you take shortcuts without realizing it, when you assume something is harmless because it's easier than looking into it properly. And that's exactly what we did. We had decided to spend a week in the mountains. Not too remote, but still quiet enough to feel like a break from everything, near a lake where the kids could play and where there were a few other houses scattered around, close enough that you knew people were there, far enough that you still felt like you had your own space. It wasn't completely isolated, which was intentional, because with children you think about those things. You think about access, about safety, about what you would do if something went wrong. And we felt comfortable knowing there were other families nearby, that we weren't entirely cut off from help if we needed it. I have 3 children, 2 older boys who are twins, and my youngest, a girl who was 4 at the time, 5 now. The 3 of them have always been close in a way that made things easier for us, because the boys were protective of her without being overbearing, patient in a way you don't always expect at that age. And even though they were only 2 years older, they understood enough to look out for her. What stood out the most, though, was her independence, because from a very early age she seemed to move through things faster than expected. She stopped needing things before we thought she would. She slept on her own without issues. She handled herself in ways that made us trust her more than we probably should have. And that trust, as I've come to realize, played a part in what happened. We arrived on a Sunday evening, later than planned, because there had been an issue with the booking the day before, something about maintenance. They refunded us one night and asked us to come a day later, which at the time seemed reasonable enough. Inconvenient, but not alarming. And since they handled it professionally, we didn't question it further. What we didn't know then, and only found out much later, was that the previous guests hadn't left because of a simple inconvenience. They had filed a complaint, something serious enough that the owners needed time to deal with it before letting anyone else in. And instead of explaining that, they chose to resolve it quietly, assuming that whatever the issue had been, it was now gone. When we arrived, everything looked normal. The house was exactly what we expected: clean, spacious, well kept. The kind of place designed for families. And outside, near the lake, there were already people, children playing, parents watching from a distance. The kind of atmosphere that immediately puts you at ease, especially after a long drive. We settled in without thinking much about it, unpacked, let the kids explore. And for all intents and purposes, it felt like the beginning of a good week. Maybe not as quiet as my wife and I would have preferred, but perfect for them, which was the point. That first night, though, something changed. At around 2:30 in the morning, we were woken up by our daughter standing by the bed, asking if she could sleep with us. Her voice low, hesitant in a way that immediately caught our attention. But not enough for us to think anything was seriously wrong. At the time, it seemed simple. She had never slept anywhere other than her own room back home, even though she was independent, even though she handled things well. She was still a child in an unfamiliar place. So, we didn't question it. We told her, of course she could stay, that it was completely fine. And I remember very clearly that part of me was actually happy about it. When children grow up quickly, when they become independent earlier than expected, there's a part of you that misses those moments. The small things, the closeness. And having her there with us that night felt like getting a piece of that back. Something I didn't realize I had missed until it was there again. My wife felt the same. I could see it without us needing to say anything. That quiet understanding that even though she had grown so much, she was still little, still needed us, still wanted to be close sometimes. She did seem scared, though. Not in an exaggerated way, not crying or panicking, but there was something in the way she stayed close, in how quickly she settled once she was between us. Like she had been holding something in and only felt safe once she was no longer alone. Even so, we didn't think much of it. We told ourselves it was normal, that it made sense given the circumstances, and eventually we all fell back asleep. The next day, we noticed she was quieter than usual, a bit more withdrawn, more tired. But again, we had an explanation ready because she had woken up during the night, had taken longer to fall asleep again, so of course she would be more subdued during the day. At no point did we consider that it might be something else. It was later that same day, while my wife and I were sitting by the lake watching the kids play, trying to settle into that rhythm you get on the second day of a trip, when things start to feel familiar enough that you let your guard down a little, that one of my sons came over to us, a bit hesitant, and told us that his sister had said there was a monster under her bed. Now, we had never dealt with that before. Not with any of our kids. Partly because the boys had always shared a room, and partly because our daughter, as I told you, had never really gone through that phase. She had always been unusually independent, unusually composed for her age. So, when we heard that, we looked at each other in that way parents do, half concerned, half resigned, as if to say, well, here it is. This is the part everyone talks about. And I genuinely believed we were doing the right thing. That night, we sat down with her, spoke calmly, explained that there was nothing under the bed, that sometimes our minds create things that feel real, especially in new places. And we even got down on the floor with her and checked together, lifting the covers, looking underneath, showing her that there was nothing there. That's when she started to cry. Not loudly, not in a way that felt like a tantrum, but a quiet, strained kind of crying that, if I'm honest, hit me harder than I expected, because it didn't feel like she was trying to convince us of something. It felt like she was reacting to something she believed she had already seen. I reassured her, tried to keep my voice steady, told her everything was fine, that we could check again if she wanted, and then I did something I regret more than I can properly explain now, which was insisting, gently but firmly, that she sleep in her own room that night. Because in my mind, I was helping her overcome a fear. I was giving her confidence. I was showing her that there was nothing to be afraid of. We stayed with her for a while, read her a story, kept things as normal as possible, then turned off the light and went back to our room. It was around 2 in the morning, maybe a little after, when we woke up to the sound of her crying again. I called out to her immediately, before even turning on the light, already moving, already halfway out of the room, telling her I was coming. And I don't know if that was the right reaction or not, but it was instinct, the kind that doesn't wait for you to think. When I reached her room, the first thing I noticed was the cold. It shouldn't have been cold. And then I saw the window. It was half open. I remember standing there for a second, trying to process it, because the window had a latch, something you had to lift and adjust before you could open it. And although it was within her reach, I found it hard to believe she had managed to open it herself, especially in the middle of the night, especially in that state. Still, I asked her if she had opened the window. She didn't answer. She just kept crying, the same way as before. And it took a while, maybe 10, 15 minutes, before she was able to say anything at all. And when she did, she said again that there was a monster in her room. That's when something shifted for me. It wasn't panic, not yet, but it was enough to make me uncomfortable in a way I couldn't dismiss, because now there was something physical to go along with what she was saying, something that didn't fit neatly into the explanation we had given ourselves. She slept with us that night again, and the next day I couldn't let it go. I spent most of it talking to my wife, going over it again and again, trying to find a reasonable explanation. But at the same time, feeling that something wasn't right, that maybe what our daughter had been trying to tell us wasn't just a phase, wasn't just imagination. I didn't know what it was. I wasn't prepared for what it turned out to be. That night, I decided I was going to find out. I told my wife what I was planning, and we agreed that our daughter would sleep with her while I stayed in the room, set things up to make it look like she was still there, arranging the blankets in a way that would mimic the shape of a body under the covers, making it convincing enough that, from a distance, it wouldn't raise suspicion. Then I hid inside the closet. At first, nothing happened. Time passed slowly. The kind of slow that makes you question your own judgment, makes you wonder if you're overreacting, if you've built something up in your head that isn't really there. And I could feel myself starting to lean in that direction, starting to believe that maybe it had been her, maybe she had opened the window, maybe everything else had followed from that. And then, at around 2:45, I heard something. A sound from the direction of the window. I looked, and I froze. There was a man outside, dressed entirely in black, his face covered by a mask that, in any other context, might have seemed almost harmless, something you'd expect to see at a children's event or a carnival. But on an adult, in that moment, in that place, it was one of the most unsettling things I have ever seen. He used something thin, something like a tool, to lift the latch from the outside, with a precision that suggested he had done it before. Then slowly pushed the window open and climbed inside. I can't fully describe what I felt in that moment, except to say that it was immediate and overwhelming. A rush of anger, fear, something protective that made me want to jump out right then and there, to stop him before he could take another step. But I didn't. Something held me back. Maybe the need to understand what he was doing. Maybe the instinct to wait for the right moment. And so I stayed there, watching. For several minutes, he didn't move. He just stood in the corner of the room, looking at the bed. It was probably the most bizarre and disgusting moment of my life. Seeing an adult man wearing a mask inside my daughter's room, watching her sleep. I could literally feel my stomach turning completely. Then slowly, he approached. He leaned in, as if checking whether she was really there. And then, without hesitation, he crouched down and slid under the bed. That was it for me. In that moment, every possible scenario ran through my head at once. Every fear, every possibility of what he might have already done or intended to do. And I lost control. I burst out of the closet, crossed the room in seconds, grabbed him by the leg, and pulled him out from under the bed. And from that point on, it wasn't a plan anymore. It was just instinct. I hit him wherever I could, not thinking, not holding back. He fought back. It was chaotic, disorienting, the room still mostly dark, both of us moving and struggling. At some point, I managed to rip the mask off his face, catching only a glimpse of him before he kicked me hard enough to knock me off balance. I fell, and that gave him just enough time. He got up, moved quickly, and before I could recover, he was already at the window, climbing out the same way he had come in, disappearing into the dark. By then, the whole house was awake. My wife was calling out for me, not screaming, but urgent and controlled, already reacting. And when she came into the room, she was on the phone, calling emergency services. Her voice steady in a way I don't think I could have managed at that moment. The kids were together in the other room, confused and scared. The police arrived quickly. They searched the area, checked the perimeter, spoke to the other families, who were now outside trying to figure out what was going on. And that's when we found out that we hadn't been the first. The couple who had stayed there before us had reported something similar. They didn't have children, but they believed someone had been inside the house while they were sleeping. That's why the booking had been delayed. That's what they hadn't told us. We took our daughter to the hospital immediately, because at that point, I couldn't take any chances. I needed to know that he hadn't done anything before we realized what was happening. And I don't think I've ever felt relief like I did when the doctor confirmed that she was physically fine. Only then did I feel like I could breathe again. But that doesn't mean everything was fine, because even now, a year later, she still struggles, still wakes up at night, still needs the light on. And I can't help but think about those moments when she tried to tell us, when she said there was something there, and we told her it wasn't real. I don't know what that man wanted. I don't know how long he had been coming in and out of that house. But I do know that if I had waited one more night, if I had dismissed it again, I don't know what I would have walked into. Before I tell you what happened to me, I think it's important to explain the kind of person I am. Because if I don't make that clear first, then none of this is going to make much sense. I've never been a paranoid person. I'm also not a small guy, and because of that, I usually feel comfortable in most situations. Walking alone at night through isolated areas, hiking deep into forests, camping far away from other people, none of that has ever really bothered me. I've always been relatively well prepared to defend myself if I absolutely had to. At the same time, though, I'm not stupid, and I don't go looking for confrontations. If I don't know somebody's intentions, and especially if I have no idea whether they're armed or not, then obviously I'm going to do everything possible to avoid conflict. To me, that's just common sense. So when all of this happened, it wasn't because I was inexperienced, careless, or mentally unstable. In fact, pretty much everything was lined up for this trip to go perfectly. Another thing that's probably important to mention before I get into what actually happened is that I'm extremely used to hiking and camping in remote areas. I've spent time in several national parks over the years without ever running into any serious problems. Sure, every now and then you come across weird people out there, and occasionally you meet someone who gives you the feeling that they probably don't have the best intentions, but never anything that genuinely made me question reality itself. And that brings me to another important point. I don't do drugs, I don't drink, I take good care of myself physically, and I've never had any kind of mental disorder or history of hallucinations. So, whatever it was that I saw out there, I genuinely cannot explain it. I'd heard stories about the Appalachian Mountains before all of this happened. Everybody has. Most of them are probably exaggerated or completely made up, because people love inventing stories about places like that. Still, after what happened to me, I don't really know what to think anymore. A few months ago, I decided I was going to spend 2 weeks hiking, climbing, and camping through a remote section of the Appalachians. Trips like that are something I do whenever I can. Most of the time, I can't stay out there for that long because of work, although whenever I get the chance, I take it immediately. The first week and a half of the trip went incredibly well. I met other hikers and climbers along the way, most of them friendly people who were always willing to exchange advice, share resources if necessary, or simply stop for a quick conversation before continuing down the trail. In isolated areas like that, people tend to look out for each other, because everyone understands that problems can happen very quickly once you're far enough away from civilization. By the end of the second week, though, I had moved into a much more remote area, well beyond the main trails and far away from where most hikers usually stayed. That wasn't unusual for me. Like I said, I'd done this kind of thing many times before, and I felt completely capable of handling myself out there. I knew how to navigate, how to stay supplied, and how to avoid putting myself into dangerous situations whenever possible. Still, even with all that confidence, I've always believed there's a difference between being prepared and being reckless. At that point, I'd probably been off the main trail for around 5 hours when I started looking for a place to set up camp for the night. In areas that isolated, you have to be careful about where you stop. You want decent visibility, access to water, and terrain that won't become a disaster if the weather changes overnight. And eventually, I found what looked like the perfect spot. There was a large rock formation behind a relatively flat clearing. and a small creek running just ahead of it. The ground was dry enough for a tent. There was natural cover from the wind, and overall, it felt like exactly the kind of place experienced hikers hope to come across late in the day. The problem was that I couldn't have been there more than 10 minutes before I noticed someone watching me. Off in the distance, partially hidden behind a cluster of trees, there was a man standing completely still. Even now, I can picture him clearly. He was dressed in black on the upper half of his body, while the lower half looked like jeans, although he was far enough away that I couldn't make out every detail properly. What I could see without any doubt was the brim of his cap pointed directly toward me. I couldn't see his face, but I knew he was staring at me. At first, I wasn't immediately alarmed. People cross paths in the mountains all the time, and if I had thought that spot was ideal for camping, then it was perfectly plausible that somebody else had thought the exact same thing. So I simply gave him a wave. But the second I did, he pulled himself back behind the trees. Not casually, he hid. That was the first moment where something started feeling wrong. Either he was an extremely cautious person who got nervous after realizing I had spotted him, or he had been intentionally trying to avoid being seen in the first place, which obviously wasn't a great sign. I hadn't even made any aggressive gesture toward him. I had simply acknowledged him with a wave. The whole thing left me uneasy enough that I decided not to camp there after all. The location itself was perfect, but there were plenty of other places to stop, and I didn't see any reason to ignore my instincts over something that already felt off. So I packed my gear back up and kept moving. I walked for roughly another hour before finally finding another area that felt isolated enough for me to settle down again. By that point, I felt reasonably confident that I had put enough distance between myself and wherever that man had been. I hadn't heard any footsteps or movement behind me the entire time, so I was genuinely convinced I had left him far behind. I set up camp, started a fire, ate a little, and for a while everything seemed completely normal again. Then, sometime around 11 that night, after it had been fully dark for hours, I thought I saw movement in the distance. The problem with campfires in places like that is that once your eyes adjust to the firelight, everything beyond it becomes almost impossible to see properly. The darkness outside the reach of the flames feels absolute, and your vision naturally locks onto the illuminated area directly in front of you, while everything else turns into shifting shadows. Almost immediately, I felt uncomfortable. So I grabbed my flashlight and, at the same time, reached for the protection I had brought with me just in case something ever went wrong out there. I stepped inside the tent quickly, grabbed what I needed, came back out, and pointed the flashlight toward the area where I thought I had seen someone standing. But there was nothing there. I swept the beam slowly across the trees, checking one section after another, although I couldn't see anybody. Then, suddenly, I turned the flashlight toward the opposite direction, almost directly behind where I had been sitting. And there he was. There was absolutely no doubt about it. It was the same man. Again, he was partially hidden behind a tree, dressed in dark clothing, standing completely still. I still couldn't see his face clearly, although the moment the flashlight landed on him, he immediately pulled himself back out of sight. I only saw him for a second, maybe less, but it was enough. That wasn't an animal. It wasn't my imagination. It was a person, and he had somehow followed me through the woods without me hearing him once. At that point, I was a bit pissed. He had been following me for hours, and now he was standing around my campsite in the middle of the night without saying a word. So immediately I shouted that I was armed, and that I wouldn't hesitate to defend myself if I had to. The truth is, the idea of actually hitting another human being is insane to me, and obviously I never wanted things to reach that point, but I needed him to believe I was serious enough that approaching me would be a bad idea. At the same time though, I've spent enough time in those mountains to know there are people living out there under extremely difficult conditions. Some of them have no family support, some are mentally unwell, and some are simply trying to survive however they can. Because of that, I also shouted that if he needed food or supplies, I was willing to leave some for him. I made sure to say it loudly and clearly enough that he would understand. But he never answered. He didn't move, he didn't speak, and he didn't react in any way at all. That was the second major red flag. I've encountered strange people in remote areas before, and usually once they realize you're armed but not hostile, they either ask for help directly or quietly take whatever food you offer and disappear. That's normally how these situations go. But this was different. Either he was unbelievably shy, or something about the situation was deeply wrong. So, obviously I wasn't about to crawl into my tent and go to sleep after that. I had no idea what this person wanted, whether he was armed or whether there were other people with him somewhere in the woods. That's a genuinely dangerous situation to be in when you're isolated, miles away from anybody else. So I stayed awake the entire night. The moment morning light came, I packed everything quickly and started moving again. By then, I had already decided I was done exploring remote sections of the mountain and that I was heading back toward the trails. There was no point staying out there anymore. For the next several hours, I kept hiking steadily toward the trail system, and eventually I started feeling calmer once I realized I was getting close again. But then, just as I was nearing one of the trails, I heard something moving off to my right. I looked over immediately, and this time I saw him clearly. And this is the part I genuinely cannot explain. One thing is having somebody follow you through remote trails. As unsettling as it is, that unfortunately does happen sometimes. There are strange people everywhere, including out in the mountains. But what I saw standing there was something completely different. The figure was partially hidden between the trees again, although close enough now that I should have been able to make out his face properly. Except he didn't seem to have one. I know how insane that sounds, and believe me, I've replayed that moment in my head more times than I can count, trying to come up with some logical explanation for it. I saw a white man standing there, or at least what looked like a white man, but there were no visible eyes, no nose, no mouth. His face looked completely blank. Even now, I don't know whether what I saw was some kind of mask, whether the lighting and distance somehow distorted my vision, or whether this was a person with some kind of severe condition that I simply couldn't understand in that moment. Maybe it was somebody genuinely in need of help. Maybe it was somebody intentionally covering their face in a way I had never seen before. I honestly don't know. All I know is that the second I saw him clearly, I felt a level of fear I had never experienced before in my life. Like I said before, I'm not someone who scares easily. I've had dangerous encounters before. I've run into aggressive people while hiking. I've been caught in storms, gotten lost temporarily, dealt with wildlife, all kinds of situations that would probably terrify most people. But this was different. The shock of seeing that thing standing there without a face hit me so hard that my body just reacted, and I started running. I turned and sprinted through the woods as fast as I could without even thinking about it. I didn't stop to look behind me. I didn't stop to catch my breath, and I genuinely don't think I slowed down once until I reached one of the main trails again. At that point, the only thing in my mind was getting back to an area where other people might be nearby. I kept moving until I finally reached a ranger station further down the trail system. Once I got there, I reported everything. I explained that there was either somebody out there who potentially needed serious medical or psychological help, or somebody intentionally hiding their identity and stalking people off trail. I made it very clear that I honestly didn't know which one it was. After I finished explaining the situation, one of them looked at the other for a couple of seconds. According to them, there had been multiple stories from hikers claiming that a faceless man was wandering around isolated off-trail areas of the mountains, usually watching people from a distance before disappearing back into the woods. Apparently, nothing directly violent had ever happened. The man never attacked anyone, never approached close enough to physically threaten somebody, and never spoke. He would simply appear at a distance, watch people silently, and then vanish whenever someone tried to get closer or identify him properly. The rangers told me the situation had already been reported to local authorities, although from what they understood, nobody had been able to figure out who the person was or what exactly was happening. Every description was almost identical, yet nobody had ever managed to get close enough to confirm whether it was a mask, some kind of deformity, or something else entirely. And honestly, that's it. That's what happened to me. I keep trying to come up with rational explanations because that's naturally where my mind goes first. Part of me still believes it was probably somebody covering their face somehow, maybe in a way that distorted the features completely from a distance. I don't know. What really pushed me into talking about it, though, was seeing a story on Reddit a few weeks ago about supposed faceless creatures wandering through certain parts of the Appalachian Mountains. I didn't believe any of it. Honestly, I still don't. I'm an extremely skeptical person when it comes to stories like that. And I'm not suddenly claiming I encountered something supernatural. At the end of the day, everybody is going to decide for themselves what they think happened. And I only know what I saw. Whatever that thing was standing in those woods, it was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I genuinely hope nobody else ever runs into it. There's something strange about spending time inside other people's homes for a living, because after a while you start realizing how wildly different everyone really is. Once you see the places where they sleep, eat, argue, grow old, and keep all the things they would never show. 5 years ago, I started doing this kind of work where I would either house sit, pet sit, or sometimes both at the same time whenever people had to leave town for a few days or weeks. Honestly, most of the time it was a pretty good deal for me. I've always been relatively independent. I don't mind being alone, and there was something oddly peaceful about temporarily stepping into somebody else's routine while they disappeared for a while. Sometimes the jobs paid badly. Sometimes they paid incredibly well, Sometimes the houses were horrible, and sometimes they felt like accidental vacations. The one I'm about to tell you about genuinely felt like one of those lucky situations where I was basically being paid to spend a week somewhere beautiful. Usually I preferred staying closer to cities because it made things easier. But every now and then somebody would offer enough money or have a house nice enough that I didn't mind driving further out. And this particular job was in the Appalachians, somewhere in a mountain area that wasn't fully isolated in the sense of being completely cut off, but definitely remote enough that once the sun went down, you became very aware of how few people were actually around you. There were a few scattered homes somewhere down the road, and occasionally cars passed in the distance during the day. But at night, it felt like the entire mountain belonged to the woods. I should probably explain that I'm from a fairly isolated mountain area in California myself. So the idea of being somewhere remote didn't automatically scare me. But the Appalachians have a reputation that even people outside the US know about. There's this weird weight attached to those mountains, this endless collection of disappearances, stories, folklore, people hearing things they can't explain. And even if you don't fully believe any of it, you still grow up hearing enough stories that some part of your brain remembers them once you're actually there. Still, I was excited. The owner and I had a video call before I accepted the job, which was pretty normal for me because I liked seeing the house beforehand and understanding what the work would actually involve. And honestly, we got along immediately. You know when somebody has that energy where within 10 minutes, it already feels like you've known them for years, where conversation flows naturally and there's never that awkward phase of trying to figure each other out. That was basically what it felt like talking to him. He was around my age, funny without trying too hard, and he showed me around the property while explaining everything I needed to know about taking care of his dog, Lonnie, who was this older sweetheart of a dog that already looked adorable even through a phone screen. The only thing that felt strange during that call was how serious he became when he talked about nighttime. He told me very clearly that once it got dark, I needed to stay inside the house, no matter what I heard outside. At first, I genuinely thought he was exaggerating or joking in that slightly theatrical way people from isolated areas sometimes do when they talk about local stories. But he kept insisting in a way that eventually made it difficult to laugh off completely. He explained that strange things happened around the property after dark and that previous people who stayed there had either refused to come back or left early because they couldn't handle it, which was apparently why he had struggled to find someone willing to help him this time. The reason he needed help so urgently was because his grandmother was dying and he needed to travel to see her before it was too late. And since Lonnie was very old and had health issues, taking her with him wasn't really possible. I remember him looking genuinely exhausted while explaining all this, and because we had gotten along so well, because he seemed sincere, and because I honestly felt bad for him, I agreed to do it. He told me that as long as I stayed inside at night, nothing would happen. That was the phrase he kept coming back to. As long as I stayed inside. When I finally arrived at the property, he barely stayed 5 minutes after handing me the keys because he was already running late to leave. But before he drove off, he repeated the same instructions again. Every shutter in the house needed to be closed before dark. The doors stayed locked, and regardless of whatever sounds I heard outside, I absolutely could not go out there or interact with anything. He also explained that the upstairs bedroom was insulated better than the rest of the house, and that Lonnie usually stayed there at night because she became extremely anxious after sunset. The house itself was actually beautiful in this rough, handmade kind of way. He had mentioned during the call that parts of it had been built by him and his father, and you could tell immediately that they knew what they were doing, because despite feeling rustic, everything was incredibly solid and well designed. It was technically off-grid in some ways, but still had all the comforts of a modern home. And honestly, during those first few hours, I was mostly just impressed by how peaceful everything felt. Lonnie was even sweeter in person than I expected. I've always loved dogs, especially older ones, because there's something very human about them once they reach that age. And she spent most of the afternoon slowly following me around while I unpacked my things and got comfortable in the house. But once evening started creeping over the mountains, her behavior changed. Not suddenly, but enough that I noticed it immediately. As I went around the house, closing the shutters one by one like he had instructed, she started pacing slowly behind me, occasionally glancing toward the windows before looking back at me with this nervous energy that honestly started making me anxious too. It felt like she already knew what was coming and was simply waiting for it to begin. I took her upstairs to the insulated bedroom before it got fully dark and got everything set up properly. The bed was freshly made. The sheets still had that cold, clean feeling, like they had been changed that same day, which genuinely made me happy because not everybody who hires house sitters actually bothers preparing the space properly, and small details like that always make a huge difference when you're staying in a stranger's home. So, despite feeling nervous, I was still mostly comfortable at that point. I lay down in bed with Netflix playing quietly in the background while Lonnie rested nearby, and for a while, everything seemed fine. Until suddenly, she lifted her head and looked toward the door before letting out this tiny whine that immediately made my stomach tighten. That was the moment I knew something outside had changed. And honestly, my curiosity by then was ridiculous. Part of me desperately wanted to crack open one of the shutters and finally understand what all this paranoia was about. Because even though I was nervous, another part of me still expected there to be some rational explanation behind everything. Maybe there really was somebody wandering around the property at night trying to scare people. Maybe there were animals making sounds people interpreted as something supernatural. Whatever it was, I wanted to know. Still, I had promised him I wouldn't open anything, and more importantly, Lonnie genuinely seemed distressed, so I stayed where I was. Every so often, she would repeat the same behavior, lifting her head suddenly and whining softly while staring toward the walls or the windows. And after a while, I realized this wasn't random nervousness. She was reacting to something repeatedly, something moving around outside often enough that she never fully relaxed. At some point later that night, I got up because I wanted water, and almost immediately I regretted not bringing bottles upstairs beforehand, because my original plan had been staying in that bedroom the entire night without needing to come downstairs at all. I even remember thinking to myself that from then on, I should always keep snacks and water upstairs before dark if I was going to survive an entire week there without losing my mind. The second I reached the kitchen downstairs, I heard the whistling. very faint at first, almost blending into the silence outside, but unmistakably human. And I swear to you, hearing somebody whistle outside in the middle of nowhere at night does something primal to your body. Every hair on my arms and legs stood up immediately, and this cold, tingling feeling spread across the back of my neck so fast it almost hurt. Like my entire nervous system had recognized danger before my brain fully caught up. And suddenly the situation felt different. Up until then, I think part of me imagined something vague and folkloric, something easier to dismiss psychologically. But a whistle is human. A whistle means somebody is physically outside your house in the middle of the night while you're alone in the mountains. That terrified me in a very real way. I didn't even get the water anymore. I just turned around and went straight back upstairs while trying to convince myself that maybe it was somebody far away on the road, or maybe I had imagined how close it sounded. But deep down, I knew it had come from near the house. For a long time, I genuinely considered opening a window and yelling at whoever was outside to get the hell away from the property, because anger almost felt easier than fear at that point. But every time I thought about touching those shutters again, I remembered the promise I had made and the way Lonnie was behaving. So I stayed quiet. Eventually the night passed, but I didn't sleep at all. The next morning I was honestly nervous about opening the shutters because some irrational part of me expected there to be somebody standing directly outside waiting for me. And since the house had stayed dark the entire night, daylight almost didn't feel real until I finally opened everything and sunlight flooded back inside. But outside there was nothing. The mountains looked beautiful again. The air was crisp. Lonnie immediately became herself again the second I opened the door for her to go outside, happily wagging her tail like the previous night had never happened. And there were no footprints, no disturbances, absolutely nothing suggesting anybody had been near the house. Still, somebody had been there. I knew what I heard. So, for the rest of that day, I couldn't fully relax anymore. The whole vacation feeling was gone and replaced with this constant low-level tension where I kept scanning the woods and surrounding area for signs of movement, almost hoping to find evidence that I wasn't imagining things. When evening came again, I locked everything up much earlier than the previous night and followed the same routine with Lanny, except this time I was actively waiting for something to happen. I brought her upstairs, settled her into her bed, reassured her as best as you can reassure a dog, then quietly went back downstairs so I could listen more carefully. For hours, there was absolutely nothing. The house stayed silent. The woods stayed silent. And eventually, around 1 a.m, I started thinking maybe the previous night had been a one-off situation, or maybe whoever had been outside simply hadn't come back. So I finally went upstairs to sleep. Lonnie seemed relatively calm again, and I had just brushed my teeth and gotten into bed while watching random videos on my phone before sleeping, when suddenly she lifted her head exactly the same way she had the previous night, instantly alert, tense. I sat up immediately because by then I already understood that her reactions meant something was happening outside long before I could hear it myself. Inside that insulated bedroom, I couldn't hear anything yet, but she clearly could. So I got up again and stepped outside into the upstairs hallway. And the second I did, my body reacted exactly the same way it had the night before. That same overwhelming wave of cold moved through me the moment I heard the sound outside, Except this time, it wasn't whistling. It was some kind of melody. I honestly still can't properly explain it to this day because it sounded weirdly familiar while also being impossible to place. Almost like hearing part of a song you used to know as a child, but can no longer fully remember. And for several seconds, I just stood there in this horrible halfway state between curiosity and fear, trying to understand what I was hearing. And that was when I broke my promise. I walked quietly toward one of the shutters downstairs and opened it just enough to look outside. What I saw standing there is something I genuinely still cannot explain properly. It wasn't a person, but it also wasn't an animal. Its eyes were enormous, far too large for its face. Its mouth looked strangely small and tight, and its skin had this pale gray-yellow color that reminded me almost of damp wood or mushrooms growing underneath rotten trees. Even now, I struggle describing its shape because my brain never fully processed what I was looking at before panic took over. The second I saw it, I slammed the shutter closed immediately. I remember backing away so fast I almost tripped over myself before rushing through the house, checking every lock again, even though I already knew everything was secured. Then I ran upstairs, shut myself inside the bedroom with Lanny, and stayed there the rest of the night, barely moving. The next day, I hardly left that room at all. Even taking Lanny outside felt terrifying, because although she clearly needed to go out, I couldn't stop thinking that if that thing existed during the night, there was no reason it couldn't appear during the day too. I took her outside quickly on a leash, barely letting her move before rushing her straight back inside again. I seriously considered calling the owner and telling him I couldn't stay there anymore, but every time I thought about it, I remembered why he had left in the first place. He was saying goodbye to his grandmother, and abandoning Lonnie alone wasn't an option. So I stayed. But by the time the third night arrived, I was already deeply afraid, and I could tell my fear was starting to affect Lonnie too. After that third night, I basically stopped treating the house normally altogether, and more or less moved into that upstairs room with her. I started bringing bottles of water up there before it got dark, snacks, chargers, everything I thought I might need so I wouldn't have to leave once night came. Because even though part of me kept trying to stay rational about the whole thing, another part of me knew I had crossed some invisible line the second I looked through that shutter. And honestly, that thought completely consumed me during the days that followed. I spent hours searching online trying to find literally anything that resembled what I had seen out there. Every Appalachian story, every local legend, every creepy forum thread written by people who either genuinely believed something was out there or desperately wanted attention. And like most of the internet, 90% of it was nonsense. People making up stories, exaggerating sightings, mixing folklore together until none of it even sounded coherent anymore. But there was one detail I could not stop thinking about no matter how hard I tried. The house had an absurd number of windows. Seriously, almost every room had multiple windows and shutters facing different parts of the property. And because the house sat slightly elevated on the mountain, those windows faced different angles of the woods too. So, what kept bothering me was this incredibly simple question that I still don't have an answer for. How did that thing know exactly which shutter I was going to open? Because I know how this sounds when you tell the story afterward, and people immediately assume you probably made noise, or hesitated too long, or somehow gave yourself away. But I genuinely don't think I did. I barely cracked the shutter open before immediately seeing it directly on the other side, staring back at me, close enough that if the window hadn't been there, we would have almost been face to face. That image stayed with me constantly, and the whistling bothered me just as much. Because the strange thing is that it never sounded supernatural in the way horror movies try to make things sound supernatural. It didn't sound distorted or monstrous or unnatural. It sounded exactly like a person whistling somewhere outside at night, specifically like a man casually walking around while absent-mindedly carrying a melody under his breath. And honestly, I think that made it worse, because if it had sounded obviously inhuman, maybe my brain could have categorized it more easily. But instead, it sat in this horrible middle ground, where everything about it felt wrong without sounding impossible. It was always the context that made it even more terrifying. The isolation and the nighttime. The way the melody dragged slightly in certain parts, like whoever was making it almost understood how human whistling worked without fully getting the rhythm right. When the owner finally came back at the end of the week, I told him everything almost immediately. I explained what I had heard, what I had seen, and eventually admitted that I had broken my promise and opened one of the shutters. I honestly felt guilty about it because that had been the one thing he kept insisting I should never do. But surprisingly, he didn't get angry at all. If anything, he almost looked unsurprised. Not relieved exactly, but definitely not shocked. He actually laughed a little at one point, not because he thought it was funny, but more in the exhausted way people laugh when something has become so absurdly normal to them that they no longer know how else to react to it. He told me that, as far as he knew, whatever was outside had been happening there for years. He had reported it multiple times, had called local authorities more than once, and at one point there had even been a patrol car parked outside the property for 2 nights because he kept insisting somebody was coming onto his land after dark. But according to him, the second night the officers heard the whistling themselves, stayed in the car for a while, then eventually left and never returned. Officially, they claimed there was nothing there. Unofficially, he was convinced they had seen something and simply decided they wanted nothing to do with it. He told me he had written about it online before too, mostly on forums or social media where people discuss Appalachian folklore and unexplained encounters. Apparently, everybody always had theories, but nobody ever had actual answers. Some people thought it was some kind of animal disease causing deformed creatures in the woods. Some people leaned fully into supernatural explanations. Some people insisted isolation and darkness make human beings hallucinate patterns and things that aren't really there. He told me that over time he had at least learned one thing for certain, which was that whatever it was only ever appeared at night. During the day, the property always felt completely normal, although he admitted that during his first few weeks living there, he had behaved exactly like I did afterward, barely leaving the house, because once you've seen something standing outside your window at 2 in the morning, your brain doesn't easily accept that daylight suddenly makes everything safe again. And honestly, the thing that convinced me there was genuine danger more than anything else was still Laney. Dogs know when something feels wrong. Maybe not in some magical or supernatural sense people online like to romanticize. But animals understand threat instinctively in ways humans often ignore. And every single night that thing appeared outside, Lonnie reacted before I ever heard a sound myself. So that's really all there is to the story. We still talk fairly often, actually, and every now and then he'll message me saying it's still happening. still hearing the whistling outside after dark.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
I've always had a hobby most people find a little disturbing and scary. I'm obsessed with folklore. Not the fairy tale, Disney clean kind. I mean the stuff people whisper about when it's late and nobody wants to sound crazy. Especially folklore tied to sound, noises in the woods, voices where there shouldn't be voices, patterns people swear they heard but can't prove. It's not that I believe any of it is real. That's the thing people always get wrong. I don't go looking for monsters. I go looking for the moment where something unexplained happens, and instead of saying, "I don't know," people build entire mythologies around it. That's what fascinates me, that exact point where confusion turns into story. The truth behind the stories, that's what I chase. So when my friend Peter told me his uncle had a lake house out in the Appalachians, and asked if I wanted to tag along for a few days, I didn't hesitate. He framed it like a break, a mini vacation. Fresh air, no signal, just chill. But for me, it was something else entirely. The Appalachians are probably one of my favorite places in the world. It's where the legends are everywhere. The monsters are even bigger, and the number of people who disappear every year or come back with surreal, impossible stories is a lot. I couldn't contain my excitement and said yes immediately, without even thinking twice. After that, I spent days and days locked in my basement, trying to figure out which story I was going to investigate this time. And when I found it, I couldn't have been happier. People around there have a phrase they don't like to explain. The hills have eyes. No one says it jokingly, and that's the detail that hooked me. The drive out there ended up taking longer than I had originally expected. Not because we got lost or anything as simple as that. The GPS technically worked the entire time, but because the roads gradually began to be more challenging, as if we were being guided away from places rather than toward them, with gas stations becoming fewer and farther between, houses turning into trailers and then into nothing at all, until all that remained were endless stretches of dense forest pressing in on both sides of the road so tightly that it almost felt like the sky itself was being swallowed. It's a magical place indeed. Peter didn't seem to notice any of it, or if he did, he didn't care enough to comment, since he spent most of the drive blasting music and talking about completely normal things like fishing, beer, and girls. The kind of grounded, everyday conversation that almost felt out of place against the backdrop of where we were going. While I found myself increasingly distracted, watching the tree line more than the road ahead. At one point, more out of curiosity than anything else, I reached over and turned the music down a bit and asked him, in a half-joking tone that didn't fully hide my interest, whether he had ever heard anything strange out in these parts. To which he immediately laughed and asked me to define what I meant by strange. When I clarified that I was talking about voices or sounds in the woods that didn't quite make sense, he gave me a look that suggested he was already regretting bringing me along, before telling me that his uncle's neighbors were the kind of people who would happily fill my head with all sorts of old stories if I asked them, which, whether he realized it or not, was exactly what I had been hoping for. When we finally arrived, the lake house turned out to be even better than I had imagined, sitting slightly elevated above the ground and overlooking a stretch of water so still and dark that, by the time we got there, it almost looked black, with no other houses visible nearby and no artificial light sources to break up the darkness. Just trees surrounding the property on all sides in a way that made it feel less like a clearing and more like a temporary interruption in the forest. It was genuinely stunning. Peter slipped into vacation mode almost immediately, giving me a quick tour, handing me a beer, and settling into the kind of relaxed mindset people come out here for. I tried to follow his lead, I really did, sitting on the porch and listening to the insects while watching the faint movement of the lake's surface. But even then, I could only think about everything I'd read at home and all the places nearby that I wanted to see. He must have noticed the look on my face, because he laughed and said I was always the same old me. That night, I was talking to Peter, explaining that there were a few places I wanted to check out the next day, asking if he wanted to come with me or if he preferred to stay by the lake and just relax, since that was the whole point of being there anyway. And at first he said he'd come, seemed interested even. But later that evening, things shifted a bit. We were sitting in the living room when his uncle arrived. He had been working in a nearby village and decided to come spend the evening with us instead of staying at his place there, which he usually did during the week. The conversation started casually enough, just small talk, until it turned toward the area, the forest, the kind of things people say about it. He mentioned that there were stories, a lot of them actually, about strange sounds at night. Things people hear deep in the trees that don't quite match anything familiar, and depending on who you ask, those sounds mean different things. Some people say it's just wildlife. Others believe the forest carries unnatural sounds. But there are also those who insist it's something else entirely, something that communicates in ways we don't fully understand. He talked about people who believe the forest is full of spirits, that at night they move, that they interact, that what you hear isn't random. And then he mentioned something more specific, a kind of local story about a woman dressed in black who is sometimes seen moving between the trees, not approaching, not speaking, just present. I'd already heard and read about that legend countless times, but honestly, it always struck me as one of the more far-fetched ones. Everyone had a different version, and there was no real consensus. People were probably seeing something similar and unsettling, but everything else felt like it had been made up to fit the story. At least, that's what I thought. Then his uncle said something that really caught my attention. He mentioned an old transmission station, abandoned for years, sitting deeper in the forest, about an hour's walk from the house, completely isolated, surrounded by nothing but trees and uneven ground. The kind of place you wouldn't stumble upon by accident. He said that when he was younger, not long after it had been deactivated, he had gone there once, maybe twice, and that he had heard sounds inside, strange ones, the kind that at the time he assumed came from people living there. Because it's not uncommon for abandoned structures in remote areas to be used by people who choose to live off the grid, away from everything else. Still, he admitted that it had unsettled him enough that he never went back. I had spent time looking into the area before coming, reading what I could, checking maps, trying to find anything worth exploring. And I had never come across any mention of that station, not even a vague reference, which made it feel less like a known location and more like something overlooked, something that existed just outside of what people usually pay attention to. So, after his uncle left us for the night, I told Peter that I wanted to go there the next day, that I was genuinely curious. He hesitated, said he might come, but that he'd decide in the morning, which I understood, because not everyone is comfortable with places like that, especially when they're isolated and abandoned. I told him there was no pressure, that he could stay by the lake if he preferred, enjoy the day, and I'd go on my own, because at that point, I was more interested than cautious. Looking back, I think I underestimated that. The next morning, I woke up excited in a way that now feels a bit naive, like I was focused entirely on the idea of exploring something unknown without really considering what that might involve. And I set out early, following the path as best as I could. The walk itself is quiet, almost peaceful, the kind of calm that makes you forget how far you are from everything else. It wasn't until I was maybe a mile away that I saw it, rising above the trees. The structure itself, tall, with a tower that stood out against the sky in a way that made it immediately clear how exposed and isolated it was. Even from that distance, there was something about it that didn't feel inviting. Still, I kept going. When I got closer, I saw that the area was fenced off, though parts of the fence had been cut or bent, enough to suggest that others had been there before, which reassured me slightly, because it meant I wasn't the only one curious enough to come this far. But the moment I touched the metal, I heard something behind me. It came from the direction of the trees, not loud, but distinct enough that I turned immediately, because I hadn't seen anyone on the way there, and the idea that something, or someone, was nearby without me noticing was enough to make me pause. At first I thought it might be an animal, which in itself was a concern, given where I was. But there was something about the sound that didn't quite match that, something closer to movement you'd associate with a person. I stood there for a moment, trying to decide whether I was overreacting. And even though nothing else followed, the feeling stayed. That awareness that I wasn't as alone as I had assumed. Even so, I climbed through the opening in the fence and went in. And that's where things stopped making sense in a way that I can't fully explain even now, because almost as soon as I stepped into those structures, into what used to be rooms, corridors, sections of the station, I lost my sense of direction completely. At first it didn't seem serious, just a matter of unfamiliar layout, different levels, uneven ground. But the more I moved, the less certain I became about where I had come from, where the exits were, how everything connected, and what started as curiosity slowly turned into something closer to concern. There were windows, but not always where I needed them, sometimes too high to be useful, other times blocked or positioned in a way that didn't help orient me. And I found myself moving from one space to another, trying to piece together a mental map that never quite formed. For a while, I told myself it was manageable, that I just needed to slow down, retrace my steps. But as time passed, I became more aware of the risks, the instability of the structures, the possibility of weak floors, collapsing sections, the kind of hazards that make abandoned places genuinely dangerous if you're not careful. And then there was the light that gradually, and without me noticing at first, started to fade. I could tell from the upper levels, from the way the brightness shifted, from the shadows stretching differently across the walls. And with that came a growing urgency, because being inside that place during daylight was one thing, but being there after dark, with no clear way out, was something else entirely. I moved faster, then slower again, trying not to make mistakes, trying to stay aware of where I stepped, but at the same time feeling that pressure building, that sense that I needed to find a way out before it was too late. But as I went deeper, from corridor to corridor, from one section to another, I realized that I no longer had any clear idea of which direction led outside. And that's when it started to feel less like exploring and more like being really stuck. At that point, I could feel the shift in myself very clearly, because up until then, I had still been trying to approach the situation as something I could manage, something I could solve by staying calm and thinking it through. But gradually, that gave way to something else entirely, something much closer to desperation, because the more I moved through those corridors and those rooms without finding a way out, the more aware I became that night was approaching, and I had no reliable way of leaving that place before it got completely dark. So my focus changed from trying to get out immediately to trying to find somewhere I could stay without putting myself in even more danger. Somewhere enclosed, stable enough. Somewhere that would at least give me a sense of protection against whatever might move through that structure during the night. Eventually, I came across a space that seemed more suitable than the others. A small room with 4 walls and a low ceiling, almost tucked away within the rest of the structure. And the way it was positioned made it feel, at least in that moment, like I could remain there without being easily seen, as if it offered a kind of concealment that the more open areas did not. It also seemed to be on a slightly higher level compared to where I had been before, and I remember thinking that if anything entered from the lower parts of the building, whether animals or otherwise, it would take longer to reach me there, which at the time felt like a small but important advantage. Even though in reality, I had no way of knowing how true that was. The truth is, I had never been in a situation like that before. Completely alone, deep in a forest, inside an abandoned structure, with no clear sense of direction and no guarantee of being able to leave when I wanted to. And even before it got fully dark, I was already frightened in a way I hadn't expected. A kind of fear that settles and becomes difficult to ignore. But what I didn't realize then was that it would get significantly worse once the light was gone. At first, it was subtle, something I almost dismissed as my imagination adjusting to the silence. But from somewhere in the distance, beyond the walls, beyond the immediate space I was in, I began to hear what sounded like voices. Faint and irregular. The kind of sound that you instinctively try to interpret as human because that's the closest reference you have. And yet, from the very first moment I heard them, I knew, with a kind of certainty that didn't require reasoning, that they were not people. Because there was something about the way the sound carried, the way it seemed to move through the space, that didn't align with anything I had ever heard before. It wasn't just that I couldn't understand what was being said, it was that the sound itself didn't behave like speech. It felt closer to whispering, but without the structure of words, like fragments of something that almost resembled language, but never fully formed into it. As time passed, that sound didn't remain distant. It grew closer in a way that made it feel as though the space itself was closing in, as though whatever was producing that sound was moving through the structure without following the same paths I had been using. And I could feel my body reacting before I had time to process it. My heart racing, my breathing becoming shallow, that instinctive awareness that something was approaching even if I couldn't see it. And then it became too much. There wasn't a specific moment where I made a conscious decision. It was more like my body acted on its own. And I stood up and started running, without any real sense of direction, without knowing if I was moving toward an exit or deeper into the structure. At that point, the only thing that mattered was putting distance between myself and whatever I felt was getting closer. I was completely disoriented. Every corridor looked similar to the last. Every turn felt uncertain. And I knew, even as I was running, that I might be making things worse, that I might be getting myself more lost. But stopping didn't feel like an option. And that's when I heard a voice, clearer than the others, distinct in a way that immediately set it apart. And what unsettled me most about it wasn't just that it sounded human, but that it sounded familiar. So much so that I had the almost immediate impression that I was hearing my own voice, calling out from somewhere ahead, telling me to come that way. I can't explain how that would even be possible, and even now it doesn't make sense when I try to think about it logically. But in that moment, it didn't feel like something I needed to question. It felt like something I needed to follow. Through the dim light, through the shifting shadows, I thought I could see the outline of a figure ahead, indistinct. And everything happened very quickly after that, so quickly that I can't clearly separate one moment from the next. I followed that voice. Not because I had a reason to trust it, but because something about it felt like the only direction that led out. And within what must have been less than 10 minutes, though it felt longer at the time, I found myself outside, standing in the forest, the air different, the space open again. And almost immediately, my sense of direction returned. as if something that had been interfering with it simply stopped the moment I crossed that threshold. I didn't stop to question it. I kept running through the forest toward the lake house, retracing the path as best as I could, moving as fast as I was able, until I saw the house by the lake in the distance, lights on. When I got closer, I realized they were already outside. Peter and his uncle, both of them clearly on edge, already prepared to come looking for me. By the time I reached them, the relief I felt was almost overwhelming, and I could see the same in them, that shared recognition that something had gone wrong, even before I said anything. When I finally explained what had happened, or at least tried to, because even then I couldn't fully articulate it, I noticed something in his uncle's expression that I didn't expect. Not disbelief and not confusion, but something closer to recognition, like he understood more than he was saying. Peter, on the other hand, was uncertain, somewhere between skeptical and unsettled, which I don't blame him for, because I know how it sounds. But he also knows me well enough to know that I don't invent things like that. That if anything, I tend to look for explanations rather than jump to conclusions. Still, I could tell they both saw how shaken I was. Not just from the fear of getting lost in that structure, which was real enough on its own, but from everything that came with it. The loss of orientation, the sounds, the voice, the fact that none of it behaved in a way I could understand or rationalize. After that, we stayed there for the rest of the trip, but I wasn't the same for the remaining days, not really present in the way I had been before, more like I was going through the motions, aware of everything, but unable to fully engage with it. Even being by the lake, which should have been relaxing, even with them trying to keep things light, I couldn't shake that feeling, that sense that something had happened that I hadn't fully grasped. I've tried to think about it since then, to find some explanation. And there are theories, things people talk about, like magnetic fields affecting perception, altering your sense of direction or time, especially in mountainous areas. But even if that explains part of it, it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain the voice. It doesn't explain the way the space seemed to distort. It doesn't explain why I couldn't find my way out of something that, on paper, shouldn't have been impossible to navigate. I never went back, and I won't. Whatever that place is, whatever exists within it or around it, it was enough for me to understand that some things aren't meant to be explored alone, and if anyone ever decides to go there, knowing what I've just told you, then at the very least, don't make the mistake I did. Don't go by yourself. Don't assume you'll be able to find your way out just because you found your way in. And if something tells you to leave, don't wait to understand why.